Tonight we're breaking down the complete history of every Horcrux in Harry Potter and uncovering the secrets of Voldemort's darkest magic. This is a fascinating topic, but I'll keep my narration calm to ensure you can still drift off to sleep. Thank you to those of you who've been joining us consistently. If you're falling asleep with us tonight, let me know in the comments how many nights in a row you've been here. And if this is your first night, just comment night 1. Now back to the video. Imagine a soul not as an abstract concept, but as a physical, fragile entity that can be torn, splintered, and tethered to the earth through the most unspeakable acts of violence. In the wizarding world, death is often described as the next great adventure, a natural transition that every living being must eventually face. But for one man, the mere thought of that transition was an intolerable weakness. Tom Riddle did not just fear death, he loathed it. He viewed mortality as a design flaw in the human condition, a mistake he intended to correct through the pursuit of a magic so depraved that it was scrubbed from almost every library in the magical world. This is the story of the Horcrux, the ultimate insurance policy against the grave, and the dark odyssey of a wizard who was willing to mutilate his own humanity to achieve a hollow immortality. To understand the Horcruxes, we have to look past the objects themselves, the cups, the rings, and the lockets, and look into the void they were meant to fill. We are exploring a branch of magic that exists on the very edge of what is possible. A process that requires the ultimate violation of nature, the act of murder. It is said that the soul is a cohesive whole, and to break it is to invite a level of instability that can never truly be repaired. Yet, Voldemort didn't just break his soul once, he shattered it. He pushed the boundaries of dark magic further than any wizard in history, attempting to create a sevenfold protection that would render him a god among men. But in his quest to become invincible, he inadvertently created the very roadmap to his own destruction. How did a brilliant, handsome student at Hogwarts transform into a creature so distorted that he no longer even looked human? The answer lies in the chronology of these dark vessels. Each Horcrux represents a milestone in Voldemort's descent into darkness, a trophy taken from a life extinguished, and a piece of history he sought to claim as his own. From the damp, ancient corridors of the Chamber of Secrets to the high-security vaults of Gringotts, and from the ruins of a shack in Little Hangleton to the very heart of the boy who lived, the history of the Horcruxes is the history of the Wizarding War itself. We will go deep into the lore of Herpo the Foal, the ancient Greek wizard who first discovered this path, and examine why Voldemort's approach was so uniquely dangerous. We will look at the specific murders used to seal each fragment, the lives of the innocent and the significant that were traded for a few more decades of cold, calculated existence. There is a deep irony in the items Voldemort chose. He sent out the relics of the Hogwarts founders, wanting to tether his soul to the most prestigious symbols of magical heritage. Yet he hid them in places that revealed his deepest insecurities and his desperate need for belonging. This journey takes us through the detective work of Albus Dumbledore, who spent years tracing the bloody breadcrumbs of Tom Riddle's past to identify these hidden anchors. It's a story of sacrifice, from the tragic end of the Potter family to the quiet, agonizing mission of a house elf named Creature. We will analyze the specific protections placed around these objects, the curses, the potions, and the mental traps designed to keep the soul fragments safe at any cost. And finally, we will witness the systematic dismantling of Voldemort's immortality, piece by agonizing piece, as Harry, Ron, and Hermione realize that to save the world, they must destroy the very things that kept their enemy tethered to it. The stakes could not be higher. As long as even a single fragment of Voldemort's soul remained intact, he could never truly be gone. He would always be a shadow in the forest, a vapor in the wind waiting for a chance to return. This is more than just a list of magical items. It is an examination of the cost of power and the ultimate futility of trying to outrun fate. It is a look at how a man who thought he was master of all things failed to understand the most basic laws of magic and love. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the flickering light of the pensieve guide us back through the decades. We are going to uncover every secret, every murder, and every hidden location in the complete dark history of Lord Voldemort's Horcruxes. There is an arithmetic that the wizarding world refuses to speak aloud, a dark mathematics that deals not in numbers but in fragments of the human soul. And at the center of that forbidden equation stands a single figure, Tom Marvolo Riddle, the boy who would become Lord Voldemort, the only wizard in history to deliberately split his soul into 7 pieces. 7, the most magical number, the number of perfection, the symbol of completion. But what happens when perfection becomes an obsession? What happens when a soul, meant to be whole, is carved apart in pursuit of eternal life? To understand the Horcrux, you must first understand the soul itself. In the wizarding world, the soul is not merely a spiritual concept or a religious abstraction. It is a tangible, measurable presence. It is the core of a person's identity, their morality, their very humanity, and it is, by nature, indivisible. A soul that is whole is stable. It can pass on after death, move into the next great adventure, as the Order of the Phoenix once described. But to tamper with that integrity, to force a division where none should exist, is to commit an act of violence against the very essence of being, and the only known way to achieve that rupture is through murder. Murder is the key. When one wizard kills another, the act is so profoundly unnatural, so deeply corrosive to the fabric of magic, that the killer's soul is torn. Not metaphorically, but literally. A piece of it breaks away, like a shard of glass from a shattered window. That shard, that fragment of consciousness and life force, can then be harvested. It can be captured and bound into an object through a ritual so dark that even among the most devoted practitioners of the dark arts, it is considered an abomination. That object, once bound, becomes a Horcrux, and as long as that Horcrux exists, the creator cannot truly die. They can be wounded, reduced to a wraith, stripped of power, but they will not cross the threshold of death. The soul fragment outside their body acts as an anchor, tethering them to the mortal plane. The cost, however, is staggering. Each time a soul is split, the creator becomes less human. They lose empathy, capacity for love, any trace of warmth or compassion. Their appearance may even begin to reflect the damage within, and the more Horcrux is created, the more unstable the soul becomes. Voldemort did not stop at 1, he did not stop at 2. He pursued a number that would, in his mind, elevate him beyond mortality into something godlike. He wanted 7, not 6 Horcruxes and his own soul fragment, but 7 pieces total, with the 6th Horcrux being the final step to a perfect, unbreakable anchor. The number 7, he believed, would grant him invincibility, but why? Why this desperate, almost manic hunger for immortality? To understand that, you must strip away the legend and look at the boy behind it. Tom Riddle was not born a monster, though he became one very quickly. He was abandoned. His mother, Gaunt, a descendant of Salazar Slytherin, gave birth to him in a Muggle orphanage on the 31st of December 1926, and then died within the hour. His father, Tom Riddle Sr., a Muggle, had fled from Merope as soon as she stopped using love potion on him, so the infant Tom was left alone, with nothing but a name and a lineage that meant nothing to the world around him. He grew up in a cold grey institutions, surrounded by children who feared him and adults who could not understand him. And he discovered early that he had power. He could make things happen without touching them. He could make animals do his bidding. He could cause pain to those who angered him. But these were not gifts of joy. They were tools of control in a world where he had none. And he learned a terrible lesson, that death was the enemy. His mother had died. His father had abandoned him. The people around him were fragile, temporary. And Tom Riddle, even as a child, vowed that he would never be that fragile. He would never be abandoned. He would never be at the mercy of something as petty as mortality. This is the psychological foundation upon which his entire life was built. Immortality was not ambition for power in the conventional sense. It was a deep, pervasive terror of vulnerability. Immortality was not a luxury, it was a necessity. He could not bear the thought of his own ending. And so he began to research the darkest corners of magic. At Hogwarts, he charmed every professor, collected every clue, and eventually discovered the existence of Horcruxes. He learned of Herpo the Fool, the ancient Greek wizard who first cracked the secret. He learned that the ritual required murder, that the soul fragment had to be sealed into a vessel with incantations and blood magic. And he learned that it was considered the ultimate taboo. But for Tom Riddle, taboo was irrelevant. Only outcome mattered. He made his first Horcrux at the age of 16, using the death of Myrtle Warren, a Muggle-born girl he murdered with the basilisk in the Chamber of Secrets. He bound the fragment into a diary, a simple black book that would later become a weapon of manipulation. But that was only the beginning. Over the next 2 decades, he would create 6 Horcruxes, each one tied to a precious object, each one linked to his obsession with lineage and legacy. The ring of Marvolo Gaunt, which held the Resurrection Stone, the Locket of Salazar Slytherin, the cup of Helga Hufflepuff, the diadem of Rowena Ravenclaw, his serpent, Nagini, and unknowingly, Harry Potter. But the number 7 haunted him. He believed that 7 pieces of soul would make him untouchable. He believed that by dividing himself into 7 fragments, he would achieve a magical perfection would grant him a form of apotheosis. But here is the irony that Voldemort never grasped. His quest for perfection became his ultimate blueprint for failure. Because each Horcrux was a weakness. Each fragment he tore away from himself left him more unstable, more prone to error, more blind to the humanity he had shed. He thought he was building a fortress. In reality, he was chipping away at his own foundation. And the number 7, the sacred symbol of completion, became the mark of his incompleteness. He never achieved the full 7 intentionally. Harry was an accident, a 7th fragment he never planned for. And that accident, that uninvited piece of soul, would become the very instrument of his downfall. The boy who lived to control death, but he could not control the consequences of his own arithmetic. So as we prepare to unravel the full history of each Horcrux, we must first look back to the origin of the craft itself. Who was Herpo the Foul? What did he discover in the shadowy days of ancient Greece that set this terrible magic into motion? And how did his dark innovation ripple through centuries to shape the destiny of the most feared dark wizard of all time? That story awaits in the next chapter. The ancient sin of Herpo the Foul, a tale of the first soul ever split, and the warning that Voldemort, like so many before him, chose to ignore. In the previous chapter, we explored the dark arithmetic of Tom Riddle's ambition, his obsession with the number 7, and the forbidden art of soul splitting. But before there was Voldemort, before there was any whisper of multiple Horcruxes, there was one name, buried in ancient scrolls, and whispered only in the most shadowed corners of wizarding history. Herpo the Foul. Herpo the Foul lived in ancient Greece, long before the founding of Hogwarts, long before the Ministry of Magic of Europe had codified its laws. He was a wizard of immense intellect, and perhaps more importantly, of immense cruelty. His name has survived not because he built empires or discovered benevolent spells, but because he did something no one before him had ever dared. He learnt to bind his soul after death. The dark origins of the first Horcrux lie here, in the sun-baked islands of the Aegean Sea, where Herpo conducted experiments that would later be considered the most vile violation of the natural order. He discovered that murder, committed with the cold intent of eternal preservation, could tear the soul. But tearing was only half the problem. The fragment had to be anchored, held in place within a vessel, so that the rest of the soul, even if the body died, could not fully pass on. And so, the first Horcrux was born. But Herpo's legacy is not only a single Horcrux, he is also credited with the creation of the first basilisk, the King of Serpents. What most histories fail to emphasize is the connection between these two acts. You see, Herpo did not invent the basilisk as a mere pet or a weapon of terror. He was searching for a way to make his soul fragment permanent, to ensure that no powerful magic could ever fully destroy the vessel. The basilisk, he realized, carried death in its venom in its gaze. He bred it from a chicken egg hatched beneath a toad, a process that itself required a kind of ritualistic sacrifice and soul manipulation. Some texts suggest that Herpo used a Horcrux-like binding during the creation of the basilisk, infusing the creature with a fragment of his own dark intent. The basilisk's venom became the ultimate tool for destruction, but also, ironically, the ultimate tool for the destruction of Horcruxes. The very creature that would one day become Voldemort's instrument was first born from the same quest for immortal corruption. Why then is this history so difficult to find? Why do the libraries of the wizarding world seem to be missing entire shelves about Herpo the Foul? The answer lies in the systematic erasure of the Horcrux tradition. The Ministry of Magic, along with every major magical governing bodies across the European magical community, identified the Horcrux ritual as the single most dangerous magical artifact in existence. Not only because of the act of murder required, but because the mere knowledge of the process could tempt even the most well-meaning wizard. The temptation to cheat death is universal, and so every single text that described the method of creating a Horcrux was hunted down, burned, or locked away in restricted sections so deep that even the most curious scholar would never find them. Passages were rewritten, histories were cleansed. The wizard world attempted to scrub this magic from every library, not because they feared the dead, but because they feared the living, the ones who might read and experiment. Herpo the Foul's singular achievement, the first Horcrux, stands as a testament to his genius. He created only one. That alone marked him as a monster in his own time. He did not seek to multiply his fragments. He simply wanted to cheat death, and he succeeded in his own way, even if his final fate remains unknown. Now compare that to what Voldemort would eventually do. Herpo's single Horcrux was a direct personal pact with mortality, Voldemort's unprecedented ambition. Where Herpo sought to preserve himself as a complete individual, Voldemort sought to tear himself into 7 pieces, believing that more fragments meant more security. That is the central flaw in Voldemort's reasoning. He took a forbidden art and multiplied its dangers. Herpo was a pioneer, but Voldemort was a madman. Herpo kept his soul intact, in one vessel, one anchor. Voldemort scattered his soul like ashes across the British countryside, into relics and serpents, even into an unsuspecting child. The comparison is not one of like to like. It is like a careful craftsman versus a desperate gambler. The basilisk connection is not merely historical. The venom that flows from the basilisk fang is one of the few substances that can destroy a Horcrux beyond repair. Herpo may not have known, or may not have cared, that his creation would one day become the bane of his eventual successor. But the irony is beautiful. The creature born from the same need to secure eternal life became the tool that would dismantle that very life. As we trace the dark origins of the first Horcrux back to ancient Greece, a line formed between Herpo the Foul and the Bald, snake-faced figure who would terrorize the modern world. Both were wizards of extraordinary power. Both were willing to sacrifice everything for immortality, but only one of them understood the weight of a single soul fragment. Herpo's name was scrubbed from history because the wizarding world feared that even the memory of his success might inspire imitation. But the truth could not be entirely erased. It survives in the whispers of old books, in the cautionary tales told by Dumbledore to Harry Potter. The very existence of the first Horcrux is a warning. You cannot hunt immortality without losing yourself. And so, the serpent rises from the dust, leaving a trail of venom and broken souls. But the deepest roots of this darkness can teach us is that the line between genius and madness is thinner than the edge of a basilisk fang. To truly understand the madness that would follow, we must first understand the orphan who inherited a legacy of darkness. A boy who would grow up in a world that both forgot and remembered the sin of Herpo the Foul. The story of the Horcrux begins in the shadows of ancient Greece, with a wizard named Herpo the Foul and the first basilisk he bred. But that dark art, that vile splitting of the soul, would not reach its fullest, most twisted expression until a boy stood in a British orphanage, staring at his own reflection with a hatred that ran deeper than blood. That boy was Tom Marvolo Riddle, and his inheritance was not the gold or the land of his father's line, but something more dangerous. The belief that he was born superior, that his mother's magic made him special, and that his father's abandonment made him a victim worthy of revenge. Tom Riddle's obsession with bloodlines began the moment he learned the truth about his parents. Gaunt, a descendant of Salazar Slytherin herself, had drugged and bewitched the Muggle Tom Riddle Sr. into a forced marriage. When the potion wore off, the father fled, leaving Merope pregnant and destitute. She died in childbirth, and young Tom was left in a Muggle orphanage, surrounded by children he considered beneath him. He despised them. He despised the Muggles who ran the place. But most of all, he despised the man who gave him his name, the ordinary, cowardly Muggle who had abandoned his mother. That rejection burned inside him like a cold flame. It shaped every decision he would ever make. He would not be ordinary. He would not be weak. He would reclaim the magical heritage his mother had lost, and he would prove, beyond any doubt, that he was the true heir of Slytherin. When Albus Dumbledore first visited the orphanage, he saw a boy who was clever, yes, but also cruel. Tom had already discovered he could make things happen without a wand, could speak to snakes, could terrify other children. Dumbledore offered him a place at Hogwarts, but even then, the boy's mind was not on education. It was on legacy. He demanded proof of his magical lineage. He wanted a name, a family, a throne. And Dumbledore, perhaps unwisely, told him about the Gaunts, about Slytherin, about the bloodline he carried. That was the moment the seed of greatness, and the seed of madness was planted. At Hogwarts, Tom Riddle was a model student, charming, brilliant, and deeply secretive. He learned everything he could about the Founders, about ancient magic, about the dark arts. He was not content to merely pass his exams. He wanted power, the kind that came from forbidden knowledge, and he knew exactly where to find it. The story of the Chamber of Secrets had been whispered for centuries. A legend that Salazar Slytherin had built a hidden room beneath the school, a chamber that housed a monster only his true heir could control. Tom became obsessed. He searched the library, questioned ghosts, pored over every scrap of parchment that mentioned the chamber. He did not just want to find it, he wanted to test it. He wanted to prove to himself and to the world that he was the one worthy of Slytherin's legacy. But to open the chamber, he needed more than Parseltongue. He needed a death. The basilisk could only be unleashed if it killed, and that killing could be used for something far greater than mere vengeance. Tom Riddle was already thinking about Horcruxes. He had learned of them in the restricted section, the most terrible of magical acts. He knew that murder split the soul, but that could be a means to an end. He planned to murder someone from Hogwarts, someone whose death would be both meaningful and unnoticed. The perfect victim was the Muggle-born girl, Myrtle Warren, who cried in the bathroom because she was bullied. Tom, in the guise of a prefect, lured her into the chamber by telling her to go away, and then he commanded the basilisk. Her death was quick, but it was enough. He dipped his diary into her life force, and the first Horcrux was made. After that, Tom Riddle grew bolder. He needed to understand the full process, the incantations, the risks, the safeguards, and so he turned to the one professor who might be susceptible to his charm and ambition, Horace Slughorn. Slughorn collected talented students like trophies, and Tom Riddle was his greatest prize. They met in Slughorn's office one evening, surrounded by comfortable armchairs and the smell of crystallized pineapple. Tom asked a question, a hypothetical question of course, about whether it was possible to split a soul and preserve it in objects. Slughorn, flattered and perhaps a little drunk on his own importance, leaned in and told him the truth. He explained that a Horcrux could be created by murder, that the soul fragment could be sealed in a vessel, that the process was so dark that even most Death Eaters refused to speak of it. Tom listened, his eyes gleaming with a cold, calculating light. He pretended it was mere curiosity, but the knowledge was now his. The transition from brilliant student to cold-blooded killer was not sudden. It was a slow, deliberate choice. Tom Riddle had never felt empathy, he had never loved. What he felt was hunger, the need to prove he was above others, the need to cheat death itself. The murder of Myrtle Warren was not an act of passion, it was an experiment, and once he succeeded, once he felt the soul tear and fragment, he knew there was no going back. He had crossed a line that most wizards never even approach. He had become something other than human, and the world, the ordinary, predictable world of Hogwarts and its rules, would never contain him again. But the diary was only the beginning. He had read that 7 was the most powerful magical number. If he could split his soul into 7 pieces, with the last remaining in his body, he would be as close to immortal as any wizard had ever come. He needed more Horcruxes, and he knew exactly where to find them. The relics of the Founders, objects of immense symbolic power, tied to the bloodlines he so revered. He would steal Slytherin's Locket, Hufflepuff's cup, Ravenclaw's diadem, and the ring of his own Gaunt family. Each one would represent his victory over mortality, over the Muggle father who had rejected him, over death itself. The orphan's inheritance was not love, not wealth, not a family name. It was a dark legacy of pride and hatred, passed down through the blood of Slytherin. Tom Riddle embraced it fully. He became Lord Voldemort. And the first step on that path, the very first Horcrux, was the diary he created in the Chamber of Secrets. That diary would later be used as a weapon, a memory given life, a tool to reopen the chamber and nearly destroy Hogwarts. But that is a story for another night. The next chapter in this dark history is the one that begins with a name on a page, Tom Marvolo Riddle, and the weapon he made of his own past. We will explore that memory, that diary, when we return of his own past. We will explore that memory, that diary, when we return. By the summer of 1943, Tom Riddle had spent months tracing his family line, rejecting the taint of his Muggle father, and proving to himself that he was the true heir of Salazar Slytherin. The Chamber of Secrets had become his private sanctuary, a testing ground for powers that whispered darker promises than any textbook could contain. But theory alone was never enough for a boy who craved immortality. He needed to cross a line that even most dark wizards refused to approach. He needed to commit the ultimate sin, not just for the thrill of death, but for the cold, calculated purpose of preserving his soul forever. And so, in the spring of that year, Tom Riddle chose his victim. Myrtle Warren was a Muggle-born Ravenclaw, withdrawn and often bullied, an easy target whose disappearance would be easy to blame on the monster everyone feared but could not name. On what should have been a normal day for her, Myrtle fled into a girls' lavatory on the first floor, crying over a cruel remark. She never came out. Tom Riddle, hidden nearby, spoke a single phrase in Parseltongue, and the basilisk emerged from its pipe. Myrtle died instantly, her eyes still wide, with the shock of seeing something she should never have seen. Hogwarts was thrown into fear, the school nearly closed, but for Tom Riddle, that death was not an end. It was the beginning of something far more terrible. The murder itself was only the first step. To bind a fragment of a torn soul into a vessel required a second, secret ritual, one that Herpo the Foal had perfected centuries before, and that Voldemort would later guard with jealous silence. Tom Riddle performed that ritual on the floor of an abandoned chamber, using Myrtle's lingering essence as the anchor. The soul split, a crack that would never heal, and a tiny piece of his identity was siphoned into an object he had chosen with great care. That object was a simple Muggle diary, a black leather-bound notebook he had once used to record his thoughts. Why a Muggle diary? It seems almost absurd that a wizard who despised everything non-magical would trust a fragment of his own soul to such a mundane thing. But Tom Riddle was never foolish, only proud. The diary was perfect precisely because it was unremarkable. No witch or wizard would suspect that a child's notebook could contain a piece of someone's soul. It was portable, easily hidden, and most importantly, it was designed to be written in. The diary's pages were not just paper. They became a conduit, a living membrane through which the soul fragment could communicate, manipulate, and eventually pour itself into a new host. That dual purpose was the diary's true genius. It was not merely a container for a Horcrux. It was a sentient gateway, a weapon that could be wielded from decades away. Tom Riddle knew that one day, someone would open that diary and begin to write, and when they did, the soul fragment inside would begin to seep outward like ink bleeding into water. It would speak to them in his voice, charm them, guide them, and slowly, insidiously, it would drain their life force and rebuild his own form. The diary did not just store a memory. It stored Tom Riddle himself, a ghost with a will of his own, waiting for the chance to become real again. The mechanics of that process are chilling to consider. When Ginny Weasley later poured her heart into the diary, she was not simply confiding in a friend, she was feeding it. Every word she wrote gave the soul fragment more strength, more substance. The diary began to write back, using her own hand without her awareness, and with each response, it siphoned a little more of her vitality. Eventually, it grew powerful enough to shape solid form, to force the chamber open, and to command the basilisk once again. That is the horror of a Horcrux. It is not passive. It is a hungry thing, always reaching, always wanting to become whole. Tom Riddle could not have chosen a more fitting vessel. The diary, a tool for recording one's thoughts, became a cage for a soul fragment that longed to rewrite history. And as the ink dried on that first page, the first Horcrux was born. Voldemort's path to immortality had begun, but so had the seeds of his eventual downfall. For in choosing a Muggle object, he bound a piece of his identity to something fragile, something that could be destroyed by a single basilisk fang. But that destruction was still 50 years away. For now the diary lay hidden, waiting, patient as all true darkness is patient. And Tom Riddle, having tasted the power of eternal preservation, turned his attention to the next crime he needed to commit. There was another branch of his family, The Gaunts that still held secrets he wanted, and there was a ring, a small gold band with a black stone, that he knew would make a far more fitting tribute to his bloodline. The murder at Little Hangleton was only a few months away, and with it, the creation of his second Horcrux. We left the diary in the Chamber of Secrets, its ink still wet with the echo of a dead girl's scream. But Tom Riddle was not satisfied with a single piece of his soul. He had learnt the theory from the restrict section and the practice from the murder of Myrtle Warren. Now he wanted more, and he knew exactly where to find the next vessel. That summer in 1943, the 16-year-old orphan, who had just discovered he was the heir of Salazar Slytherin, turned his attention to his father's bloodline. Tom Riddle had always hated the name Riddle. He had grown up in a Muggle orphanage, told his father was a drunk who abandoned his pregnant mother, but he had also learned, through the Gaunt family ring and the stories of his uncle Morfin, that his mother was a pure-blood witch, descendant of the Peverells, and his father, a Muggle who had married her, then cast her aside. That was the wound that never healed. So in the summer of 1943, Tom Riddle left London for the village of Little Hangleton, a place he had never seen but whose name felt like an insult. He walked the lanes under a grey sky, past the old church and the pub, until he reached the Riddle house. The house was grand by Muggle standards, a large stone manor with ivy over the gate. Inside lived Tom Riddle Sr., his father, along with his grandparents Thomas and Mary Riddle. They were wealthy, comfortable, and utterly unaware of the darkness that shared their name. Tom Riddle knocked on the door. He was polite, well-dressed, barely 17. He told them he was their relative, that he wanted to meet them. They let him in, likely out of curiosity or the uncomfortable tug of obligation. But the conversation did not last long. Tom Riddle did not come for reconciliation. He came for revenge and for something darker, a murder that would rip his soul open again. When the Riddles were found dead the next morning, the Muggle authorities were baffled. The bodies bore no marks, no poison traceable, no wounds. The only clue was a strange, almost peaceful look on their faces, as if they had simply ceased to be. But the wizarding world knew better. The Ministry of Magic was called in, and the investigation pointed quickly to the Gaunt family, the reclusive pure-blood squatters who lived in a shack nearby. The prime suspect was Morfin Gaunt, the son of Marvolo, the brother of Merope, Tom Riddle's mother. Morfin was known for his violent temper and his hatred of Muggles. He had been heard threatening the Riddle family before, and when the Aurors arrived at the Gaunt shack, they found Morfin in a drunken stupor, clutching a ring that bore the Peverell crest. He confessed to the murders almost cheerfully, boasting that he had killed the Muggles, who had dishonoured his sister. Their only problem was, Morfin had no memory of actually doing it. The memory was a blur of rage and satisfaction, but the details were hazy. That was because Tom Riddle had used his talent for legitimacy and memory modification to plant the entire scene. He had visited his uncle Morfin the night before, knocked him unconscious, then performed the murders himself. He took Morfin's wand and used it to kill the Riddles. Then he returned to the shack, modified Morfin's memory to include a twisted confession, and left the ring, the very ring he had stolen from Morfin's finger, as a piece of evidence that tied the crime to the Gaunts. It was masterful, cruel, and completely effective. Morfin was sent to Azkaban, where he died years later, never knowing the truth, and Tom Riddle walked away with the Peverell ring. The ring was a beautiful, heavy gold band with a black stone set in its centre. For most eyes, it was an antique, a family heirloom. But Tom Riddle understood that it was older than the Gaunts, older than the Peverells, older than Hogwarts itself. The stone was not just a gemstone. It was the Resurrection Stone, one of the 3 Deathly Hallows. Tom did not know that at the time. He saw only the symbol of the Peverells, the mark of a powerful magical bloodline, and the connection to Salazar Slytherin through his descent. He saw it as a trophy, a rightful inheritance, and a perfect vessel for his fractured soul. The murder of his father was the second deliberate killing, the second rupture in his soul, and he performed the dark ritual that night in the Gaunt shack, binding a piece of himself into the ring. The irony is staggering. The resurrection stone, an object meant to call back the dead, was turned into a prison for a fragment of a wizard who feared death above all else. The stone could have been used to speak with lost loved ones, to find wisdom in the echoes of the departed. Instead, it became a tomb for a murderous soul. The very power that could have taught Tom Riddle the true meaning of mortality was desecrated into an anchor of immortality. That ring would remain hidden in the ruins of the Gaunt shack for over 50 years, waiting for the day Dumbledore would find it, and, in a moment of weakness, put it on his hand, sealing his own doom. But that is a story for later. Right now, in the summer of 1943, a boy barely 17 had just made his second Horcrux. He had killed his own father, his grandparents, and framed his uncle for the crimes. And he had done it all without a flicker of hesitation. The diary had been a test. This ring was a declaration. Tom Riddle returned to Hogwarts that autumn with 2 pieces of his soul already hidden away. He was still a student, but he was already a monster, and he was far from finished. The ring would remain on his hand for a few years, a constant reminder of his victory, and also a constant drain on whatever humanity he had left. The next chapter of this story follows that ring as it becomes the first Horcrux that Dumbledore ever destroyed, and the one that killed him. We'll explore that in Chapter 6, The Ring, the Hallow Corrupted. Tom Riddle had returned to Little Hangleton that summer, and in the space of a single night, he had erased the stain of his Muggle father from the world. The triple murder of Tom Riddle Sr. and his parents was a cold, calculated act, not a crime of passion, but a ceremony of rebirth. He had taken from his father the name he despised, and from his uncle Morfin, he had taken something far more valuable, a ring that had once belonged to the Peverell family. Though Voldemort did not know that, he saw only a relic of his mother's lineage, a symbol of the pure blood heritage he craved. But the ring carried a heavier weight than he could ever have imagined. To understand what that ring truly was, we have to go back generations into the twisted history of the Gaunt family. The Gaunts were descendants of Salazar Slytherin himself, and they had once been a proud and powerful line. But by the time Tom Riddle came of age, the Gaunts were living in a crumbling shack on a hillside, surrounded by filth and decay. They were a family that had fallen from grace so completely that even the wizarding world had forgotten them. Marvolo Gaunt, Voldemort's grandfather, was a violent, arrogant man who clung to his heritage like a drowning man clings to driftwood. He wore the ring on his finger and bragged about his ancestry, but he had no real power, no influence, no wealth. The Gaunts had squandered everything, their money, their reputation, their sanity, until all that remained was a single precious heirloom and a deep, festering madness. This descent into squalor was not sudden. The Gaunts had been declining for centuries, each generation more inbred and unstable than the last. Marvolo's daughter, Merope, Voldemort's mother, was treated as little more than a servant in her own home. She had no magic to speak of, or so it seemed, until she fell in love with a handsome muggle named Tom Riddle Sr., and in a desperate act of defiance, she used a love potion to ensnare him. But love born of magic is not love at all, and when Merope stopped feeding him the potion, believing he had come to love her truly, he abandoned her and their unborn child. She died in a London orphanage on the last day of 1926, leaving behind a son who would grow up to hate everything she had loved. That son, Tom Marvolo Riddle, would one day return to the Gaunt shack and claim the ring, but he never understood what he had truly found. The ring bore the Peverell coat of arms, 3 straight lines, the symbol of the Deathly Hallows. Voldemort, for all his obsession with magical history and bloodlines, failed to recognize it. Why? Because the Hallows were a legend he had never taken seriously. He was a man of logic and dark science, not fairy tales. The resurrection stone inside that ring could have given him mastery over death itself, but he saw it only as a pretty bauble a family trinket. He did not connect the symbol on the ring to the story of the three brothers. And in that moment, his arrogance blinded him to the greatest magical secret he could ever have possessed. Instead, he saw the ring as a vessel for something far darker. He had already created one Horcrux, the diary, using the murder of Myrtle Warren. Now, with the triple homicide of the Riddles fresh in his soul, he was ready to split it again. The ring became his second Horcrux, and he bound a fragment of his soul into that gold band with the same cold precision he had used on the diary. But he did not leave it unguarded. The ring was hidden in the floorboards of the Gaunt shack, beneath a layer of rotten neglect, and it was protected by a curse so insidious that even Albus Dumbledore would not walk away unscathed. The enchantments placed on the ring were designed to punish anyone who tried to claim it. The most powerful was a lethal curse, a kind of magical trap that would activate the moment the ring was put on. It was not a simple killing curse. It was something subtler, something that would cause a slow, agonizing decay. The curse targeted the wearer's body and mind, withering them from within. Voldemort had crafted it with the same care he used for all his protections, a booby trap that would destroy the thief before they could understand what they had touched. And yet the ring itself remained fragile. It could be destroyed by powerful magical means. But the curse was its first line of defense. For Voldemort, the ring symbolized everything he wanted to claim: a noble magical ancestry, a link to Salazar Slytherin, and unknowingly, a connection to the Deathly Hallows. He saw himself as the rightful heir of a great line, and that ring was the physical proof of his superiority. But the irony is devastating. The Gaunts were not noble. They were broken, violent, and pathetic. Voldemort had killed his own father, framed his uncle, and stolen a relic that could have made him truly immortal. Not through Horcruxes, but through the mastery of death itself. He chose the path of fragmentation instead of integration. He divided his soul rather than uniting the Hallows. And so the ring lay in the dirt of that shack for decades, waiting. It would not be found for over 50 years. And when it was, its curse would claim a victim far more valuable than any thief. Albus Dumbledore, the greatest wizard of the age, would be undone not by a duel or a dark artifact in battle, but by a moment of weakness, a desperate hope to see his dead sister again. The ring carried the resurrection stone, and Dumbledore, for all his wisdom, could not resist its pull. But that is a story for later. For now, the ring had been transformed into a Horcrux, hidden in the ruins of a family's shame. And Voldemort, satisfied with his work, turned his attention to the next prize, a beautiful golden cup that had once belonged to Helga Hufflepuff. To obtain it, he would need to charm an old woman, commit another murder, and begin a chain of thefts that would lead him deeper into the dark heart of the wizarding world. That heist and the lies that surrounded it would become the center of the next chapter in his rise to power. When Tom Riddle left Hogwarts, he carried with him not just a first-class education in magic, but 2 Horcruxes already hidden in the world: the diary, buried in the possessions of Lucius Malfoy, the ring, tucked away in the ruins of the Gaunt shack. He had proven to himself that murder was a tool, that his soul could be split, and that immortality was within his reach. But Tom Riddle was not satisfied with 2 pieces of his soul. He wanted 7. He wanted to become something more than a man. He wanted to become a legend. And so, after a brief and mysterious disappearance from the wizarding world, he resurfaced in a place that would allow him to move, unseen among the powerful and the desperate. He walked into Borgin and Burke's, that dark little shop in Nocturne Alley, and asked for a job. Borgin and Burke's was not just a purveyor of cursed objects and dark artifacts. It was a clearinghouse for the secrets of old families, the desperate heirs who needed to sell heirlooms they did not understand, the widows who parted with relics they could not protect. And Tom Riddle had a talent for finding things, not just any things, the things that mattered, the things that carried history, that hummed with ancient magic, that were tied to the founders of Hogwarts or to the most powerful wizarding bloodlines. He was charming, young, impossibly handsome, and eerily persuasive. Customers would come in with a dusty locket or a tarnished cup, and Tom would offer to appraise it, to make an offer, to handle the sale personally. And then, in the quiet back rooms of Borgin and Burke's, he would study the object, trace its lineage, and decide whether it was worthy of holding a piece of his soul. He was not just a salesman. He was a collector, a hunter, a predator, wearing the mask of a polite young assistant. It was during these years that he heard whispers of a wealthy old woman named Hepzibah Smith. She lived in a grand house near the outskirts of the wizarding world. Surrounded by treasures she could barely remember acquiring. She was a descendant of Hufflepuff, and she possessed two items that Tom Riddle had been hunting for years. The first was a small cup, engraved with a badger, the symbol of Helga Hufflepuff. The second was a locket set with a serpentine S, the mark of Salazar Slytherin. These were not just antiques. These were relics of the founders, objects of unimaginable power and significance. Tom Riddle ingratiated himself with Hepzibah Smith with the same charm he had used on everyone from his Hogwarts professors to the Gaunts. He would visit her home, bring her small gifts, flatter her endlessly, and listen to her rambling stories about her family history. Hepzibah was lonely, vain and desperate for attention. She saw in Tom a handsome young man who appreciated her treasures. She did not see the cold calculation behind his eyes. She showed him the cup, the Hufflepuff cup, with its two finely wrought handles and the badger engraved beneath a patina of age. She told him that it had belonged to Helga Hufflepuff herself, passed down through generations of her family. And then she showed him the locket, the Slytherin locket, heavy and ornate, with a serpentine S worked into the gold. She did not know that this locket had once belonged to Salazar Slytherin himself, that it had been lost for centuries, until it resurfaced in the hands of the Gaunts, and then through a series of thefts and inheritances, found its way to her. She did not know that Tom Riddle was the heir of Slytherin, and that this locket was his birthright. Tom Riddle smiled, praised her collection, and left, but he had already made his decision. These two objects would become his next Horcruxes. He needed murder to create them, and he needed a victim who would not be missed, or who would be easily forgotten. Hepzibah Smith was perfect. He returned for tea one afternoon, bringing with him a box of chocolates laced with the slow-acting, untraceable poison. He watched her eat them, watched her smile fade, watched her eyes widen as the poison took hold. And when she collapsed, he made sure to leave behind the house elf, Hoki, trembling and confused, holding the empty chocolate box. Hoki was convicted of killing her mistress by poisoning, a crime she could not possibly have committed. But no one questioned it. Why would they? A house elf is loyal to the point of self-destruction, and a house elf with a motive, real or imagined, is the easiest scapegoat in the wizarding world. Tom Riddle walked out of Hepzibah Smith's house with the Hufflepuff cup and the Slytherin locket in his pockets. He had murdered her with a piece of chocolate, and he had framed an innocent creature for his crime. He felt no guilt. He felt only satisfaction. He had found what he was looking for. That night, in a dark room somewhere in London, Tom Riddle turned the Hufflepuff cup into a Horcrux. He committed the ritual, poured the murder of Hepzibah Smith into the cup, and watched as the metal seemed to darken, the badger engraving shifting slightly as though it had come alive and then died. He did the same with the Slytherin locket, binding the soul fragment into the gold with the same careful, deliberate magic. But something was changing in him. The creation of Horcruxes was not just an act of dark magic, it was a transformation. Each time he split his soul, he lost a little more of what made him human. His face began to lose its handsomeness. His eyes grew redder, his skin paler. He was becoming something other than a man. He was becoming Voldemort. After the Hepzibah Smith heist, Tom Riddle quit Borgin and Burke's. He disappeared into the shadows, and for a long time, no one knew where he had gone. He travelled to Albania, to the forests where the ancient dark magic still clung to the earth. He sought out lost knowledge, He committed murders for the sake of creating more Horcruxes, and he began to build an army. He was no longer a shop assistant, no longer a charming young man. He was a wraith in the making, a creature of pure ambition, driven by the need to conquer death itself. But what he did not realize, what he could never realize, was that his obsession with finding and corrupting these relics was also revealing his own weaknesses. Each Horcrux was a clue to his past, to his obsessions, to the things he valued above all else. And the Locket, the Slytherin Locket, would become one of the most telling of all. It would be hidden in a cave surrounded by inferi, protected by a potion that forced the drinker to relive their worst memories. It would be guarded by spells that only the most determined would dare to face. And it would be found, eventually, by a boy who had already faced worse. But before we reach that cave, before Ron Weasley draw the sword of Gryffindor against the Locket's dark influence, we have to understand what that Locket meant to Tom Riddle. We have to understand the pride, the obsession with lineage, the need to prove that he was the true heir of Slytherin. That story, the story of the Locket's creation and its long journey through the hands of thieves and murderers, is waiting for us in the next chapter. The Locket of Salazar Slytherin did not begin its journey as a trophy of blood purity. It began as a last shred of dignity, sold for a pittance by a desperate woman in a filthy shack. Gaunt, the daughter of Marvolo, the sister of Morphin, had already endured a life of isolation and abuse. When she fled the Gaunt hovel after being abandoned by the Muggle Tom Riddle, the father of the child she carried, she had nothing left but the family heirlooms, and among them, the Locket. Heavy gold. Here's the full script continues. I think I need to output full script. Let me write. The Locket of Salazar Slytherin did not begin its journey as a trophy of blood purity. It began as a last shred of dignity, sold for a pittance by a desperate woman in a filthy shack. Gaunt, the daughter of Marvolo, the sister of Morphin, had already endured a life of isolation and abuse. When she fled the Gaunt hovel after being abandoned by the Muggle Tom Riddle, the father of the child she carried, she had nothing left but the family heirlooms, and among them, the Locket. Heavy, cold, and emblazoned with the serpentiness of Slytherin, it was her only anchor to a legacy that had long since rotted. She walked the muddy lanes to the edge of the village, her swollen with her unborn child, and found her way to the grimy shop of Caractacus Burke. Burke was a dealer in the macabre and the ancient, a man who knew the value of relics, but also the despair of sellers. Merope offered him the Locket. She did not know its true history, only that it was old, and that her father had treasured it beyond reason. Burke, ever the opportunist, saw the Slytherin crest and recognized the piece as a lost artifact, but he also saw a woman too weak to bargain. He offered her 10 galleons, a pittance, an insult. She accepted, and so Salazar Slytherin's Locket passed from the last of his direct bloodline into the grimy hands of a dealer who would keep it locked away for decades. Gaunt died shortly after died in a London orphanage, having given birth to a son she named Tom Marvolo Riddle. She had sold her family's pride for what she thought was survival. But that Locket was already beginning to take on a darker meaning. It was a relic of the purest magical bloodline, Slytherin's own line. Yet it had been bartered away for a handful of gold by the woman who should have been its guardian. That irony would not be lost on the child she left behind. For many years, the Locket sat in the back room of Borgin and Burke's shop in Nocturne Alley. It was occasionally admired by dark wizards passing through. But Burke was shrewd. He knew that such a piece would fetch a far higher price from the right buyer, and eventually that buyer came in the form of a wealthy old woman named Hepzibah Smith. Hepzibah was a collector of treasures, a descendant of Hufflepuff, with a particular fondness for artifacts tied to the founders. She had already acquired Helga Hufflepuff's golden cup from Burke, paying an enormous fortune for it. When she learned he also possessed Slytherin's Locket, she insisted on purchasing it as well, and so the Locket moved from the cold shelf of a dealer into the velvet-lined jewellery case of a vain, aging woman who saw it as a status symbol. But it was not Hepzibah Smith who would transform the locket into something far more terrible. That honour, or curse, belonged to a young man who had insinuated himself into her trust. Tom Riddle, now calling himself the Higher of Slytherin, worked at Borgin and Burke's precisely to hunt such relics. He knew the locket was his birthright. It had been stolen from his mother by Burke. It was now sitting in Hepzibah's home, displayed as a trinket. The irony burned in him. He charmed the old woman, flattered her, and one summer afternoon he visited her home alone with her. He poisoned her tea, then he took the cup and the locket. He staged the death to appear natural, and he vanished into the shadows with both treasures. But the locket was not yet a Horcrux. That transformation required a murder, a deliberate, ritualized slaying that would split the soul. Voldemort, as he now called himself, had already created the Horcrux of the locket sometime after Hepzibah's death. The victim was a muggle tramp, a nameless soul, sleeping beneath a bridge in a rain-swept London alley. Voldemort, moving like a shadow, cast the killing curse and felt the familiar tearing of his soul. He then performed the dark rite that bound that fragment into the locket, the same locket that had once worn by Salazar Slytherin himself. The locket of the hair, now sealed with a murder that degraded its purity, a perfect symbol for Voldemort's obsession. The relic of a pure blood lineage, corrupted by the death of the very kind he despised most. The locket became more than a container. It was a repository of Voldemort's own malignant pride. As a Horcrux, it radiated an aura that fed on the weaknesses of those who wore it. It amplified fear, envy, and self-doubt. When later, long after Voldemort's first fall, it would be retrieved from a cave submerged in icy water, guarded by Inferi. It would fall into the hands of 3 teenagers on a desperate quest, and there, wearing it around, the locket's true power would reveal itself. It would torment Ron Weasley, peeling open his insecurities like a wound. It would whisper to him that he was unloved, overshadowed, and that his best friend had chosen someone else. The locket fed on the worst inside each of them, because it was born from the worst inside its creator. But first it had to be hidden. Voldemort, ever theatrical, chose a seaside cave where he had once terrorized orphanage children. He fashioned a basin of emerald potion, a boat that would appear only for a single wizard, and a door would only open when a drop of blood was offered. The locket rested at the bottom of that basin, suspended in that glowing poison. It was there for decades, deep underground, while Voldemort rose and fell. It was only retrieved by Albus Dumbledore and Harry Potter in the summer of 1997. And even Dumbledore, the greatest wizard of his age, was reduced to begging for water-starved madness by the potion. That locket, the pride of the Heir of Slytherin, was finally destroyed by Ron Weasley in the Forest of Dean. He stabbed it with the sword of Gryffindor, which had absorbed basilisk venom, and the fragment of soul within screamed in despair. The locket that had once symbolized the supremacy of a bloodline was reduced to a mangled piece of dead metal. And yet its story does not end there. For the golden cup that Voldemort took from Hepzibah Smith, the cup of Helga Hufflepuff, was also hidden away. And while the locket was destroyed by a boy who overcame his own doubts, the cup would be retrieved from a deeper, more dangerous vault, guarded by a dragon and a creature that measured greed with shame. That vault and the journey into the very heart of Gringotts would test everything Harry, Ron and Hermione thought they knew about trust and betrayal. But that is a story for another chapter. The Slytherin locket was not the only treasure Tom Riddle took from Hepzibah Smith's collection that evening. There was something else, something she had displayed with equal pride but far less caution. A small golden cup, modest in appearance, bearing the emblem of a badger. It had once belonged to Helga Hufflepuff, one of the 4 founders of Hogwarts. And in the hands of Tom Riddle, that cup would become a vessel for murder, perhaps the most ironic form of malice the magical world had ever seen. To understand why Voldemort chose this particular object, we must first understand the reputation of the house it represented. Hufflepuff was, and remains, the house often dismissed by ambitious wizards as the house of the leftovers, the house that took everyone else, the house of the loyal, the patient, the just. In the eyes of a boy who valued power above all else, these traits were weaknesses. Hufflepuff was the house of those who did not seek glory, who were content to work hard and treat others fairly. And it was precisely this perceived softness that made Helga Hufflepuff's cup such a perfect candidate for corruption. Voldemort did not choose the cup because he admired its original owner. He chose it because he wanted to defile the symbol of everything he despised: kindness, fairness, humility. By turning this cup into a Horcrux, he was not merely continued a pattern that had already taken root inside his soul. He had twisted the legacy of Slytherin into a weapon of pure blood supremacy. He had corrupted the ring of the Peverells, the symbol of death's mastery, into a prison for a fragment of his being. And now he would take the cup of Hufflepuff, a relic meant to nurture and sustain, and fill it with something far darker than tea or mead. He would fill it with murder. The catalyst for this specific Horcrux came in the form of a death that was both quiet and calculated. Hepzibah Smith was an elderly witch, wealthy beyond measure and utterly convinced of her own immunity. She trusted Tom Riddle because he flattered her obsessions. He admired her collection. He brought her chocolates and listened to her ramble about the glorious past of her pure-blood lineage. And on the evening she showed him Hufflepuff's cup and Slytherin's locket, she sealed her own fate. Within hours, she was dead. Poison slipped into her tea, or perhaps something more subtle. The official story was that she died unexpectedly, and by the time anyone thought to question her young admirer, Tom Riddle had already vanished from Borgin and Burke's, taking the locket and the cup with him. The murder of Hepzibah Smith was not merely a theft. It was the moment Tom Riddle crossed a line he had long been approaching. He had already created 2 Horcruxes, the diary and the ring, but those killings were personal acts of revenge or deception. The murder of Hepzibah was different. It was cold, transactional and almost bureaucratic. He poisoned a harmless old woman because she owned things he wanted, and in that act, he proved that his soul was now nothing stood between him and the fulfillment of his ambition. Not conscience, not compassion, not even the fundamental respect for life that most wizards take for granted. With Hepzibah's death, Tom Riddle had the cup, but a Horcrux requires more than just murder. The soul splitting, it requires a ritual powerful enough to bind the soul fragment to an object. What that ritual entailed we can only guess. J.K. Rowling hinted that it involved drinking the blood of the victim, but the exact details remain shrouded in darkness. What we do know is that the cup became one of Voldemort's Horcruxes, carrying a piece of his soul alongside the locket, the ring and the diary, and then he had to decide where to hide it. Unlike the locket, which he stashed in a cave protected by Inferi, or the ring, which he left in the ruins of the Gaunt shack, Voldemort chose to entrust the cup to someone else, someone who would guard it with her life, someone whose loyalty was absolute. That someone was Bellatrix Lestrange, and the vault she placed it in was no ordinary vault. It lay deep within Gringotts, the most secure bank in the wizarding world, guarded by dragons, enchantments, and the legendary security measures of the goblins. The cup sat inside Bellatrix's vault, surrounded by treasures she had accumulated through violence and devotion to the Dark Lord. Voldemort could not have chosen a more ironic hiding place, a symbol of Hufflepuff's generosity and openness, locked away in the most impenetrable stronghold of greed among wizards. But why would Voldemort trust Bellatrix with something so precious? Because he understood that her fanaticism was a fortress in itself. She would never betray him. She would never even suspect that the cup in her vault was a Horcrux, for she was loyal enough to obey without question. And perhaps, in a twisted way, the cup's placement in a vault reflected Voldemort's own obsession with possession. He gathered not only power, but also objects, as if hoarding them would somehow fill the void where his humanity should have been. Yet for all his cunning, Voldemort made the same error with the cup as he had with each of his Horcruxes. He underestimated the determination of those who would seek to destroy him. He assumed no one would ever break into Gringotts, and he assumed that the cup, hidden among the gold and jewels of a Death Eater, would remain safe until the end of time. But even the safest vault in the magical world could not protect a Horcrux from a trio of wizards who were willing to risk everything. The cup's eventual destruction would come years later, in the Chamber of Secrets, by the hand of Hermione Granger, using the fang of the basilisk that had once been used to create the diary. But before that moment, the cup sat in the darkness of Bellatrix's vault, a silent relic of a house whose founder would have wept to see her legacy twisted so horribly. Helga Hufflepuff had crafted her cup to be a symbol of unity, of sharing, of kindness. Voldemort turned it into a container for murder. This pattern of corrupting the noble into objects of kindness was not unique to Hufflepuff Day. Voldemort had already defiled Slytherin's Locket. Ravenclaw's Diadem would soon suffer the fate. But the cup stands out, perhaps because it represents the most fundamental betrayal of values. Where Slytherin's house valued cunning ambition, traits Voldemort exemplified, Hufflepuff's house valued loyalty, fairness, and hard work. By taking a cup and filling it with his soul, Voldemort was not merely creating a Horcrux, he was stamping out what little remaining goodness might have lurked in the Corner's world. And so the cup remained hidden, guarded by the Lestranges, buried in the depths Gringotts, awaiting the day when it would be reclaimed by those who dared to defy the Dark Lord. But that story is still ahead. The diadem of Ravenclaw, the crown of another founder, had its own tale waiting, and for that, we must turn to the Grey Lady and the secret she carried for centuries. That secret would prove to be the penultimate piece in the puzzle of Voldemort's tragic quest for immortality. The cup of Helga Hufflepuff was now sealed in its dark purpose, a relic of kindness turned to malice by the same hand that had taken Hepzibah Smith's life. But Voldemort's hunger for immortality was far from satisfied. He had the locket, the ring, the diary, and now the cup. 4 Horcruxes, each anchored to a founder's legacy. Yet one founder remained untouched, and the diadem of Rowena Ravenclaw had been lost for centuries. No living soul knew where it rested, but Voldemort knew that the dead sometimes speak more freely than the living. It was during his final years at Hogwarts that Tom Riddle began his most subtle and dangerous charm offensive. He had already proven himself a master of persuasion among the living, but now he turned his attention to the spectral inhabitants of the castle. Among them was the Grey Lady, the ghost of Helena Ravenclaw, daughter of the founder herself. She was a figure of quiet sorrow, often found wandering alone, her silver robes trailing behind her like mist. Most students paid her no heed, but Tom Riddle saw opportunity in her grief. He approached her not with arrogance, but with a feigned humility that was almost convincing. He spoke of his admiration for the House of Ravenclaw, his yearning to understand the wisdom of its founder. He mentioned the diadem not as a treasure, but as a symbol of lost knowledge. The Grey Lady, starved for genuine interest in her mother's legacy, began to soften. Over several conversations, Tom wove a web of respectful inquiry, never pressing too hard, always retreating before suspicion could form. He was patient, and patience was a weapon he wielded with precision. And then, in a moment of vulnerability, the Grey Lady revealed the truth. Her mother, Rowena Ravenclaw, had been a woman of unparalleled intellect, but also of deep loneliness. She had confided in her daughter about the diadem, a circlet said to enhance them of the wearer. But Helena, consumed by envy of her mother's fame, stole the diadem and fled. She crossed the sea and vanished into the forests of Albania, carrying the relic with her. The betrayal shattered Rowena Ravenclaw, who fell gravely ill with heartbreak. She sent a knight to retrieve her daughter, but Helena refused to return. It was in those dark woods that tragedy struck. The knight, acting on a desperate plea from the dying Rowena, fatally wounded Helena, but the diadem was never recovered, lost among the trees and shadows of that distant land. Tom Riddle listened with perfect stillness. The Grey Lady, still haunted by guilt, told him everything. The name of the forest, the region where she had hidden it, the very tree under which she had buried the diadem before her death. She had never told another soul. But Tom Riddle was no ordinary soul. He thanked her gently and stored the knowledge away, like a key to a locked door. Years later, after leaving Hogwarts and building his power, Voldemort made his way to Albania. He wandered those dense, unforgiving forests, until he found the place the Grey Lady had described. And there, beneath the roots of an ancient tree, untouched for 1,000 years, he unearthed Rowena Ravenclaw's diadem. It was tarnished but intact, a circle of bronze set with a blue sapphire, sleek and elegant. To the world, it was a lost artifact. To Voldemort, it was the vessel for his 5th soul fragment. He needed a murder to complete the transformation, and Albania provided a convenient victim. An unnamed peasant, a muggle who lived in a remote village near the forest, crossed his path. Perhaps he was a shepherd, perhaps a woodcutter. History does not record his name. Voldemort killed him without ceremony, without passion, simply because a death was required. The magic was cast, the soul fragment split, and the diadem became a Horcrux. It gleamed with new darkness, its sapphire now holding a secret far removed from wisdom. Voldemort hid it where he felt safest, back at Hogwarts, the place of his first triumph. But he did not return it to Ravenclaw Tower. Instead, he concealed it in the Room of Requirement, that strange, hidden chamber that could become anything the Seeker needed. He placed the diadem atop a dusty bust, among a mountain of forgotten objects, where it would remain for decades, waiting. No one would think to look there, for the diadem was legend, and legends are not found in school storage rooms. Yet the Grey Lady's secret had been breached. The daughter's betrayal had paved the way for a greater betrayal, and the diadem, once a symbol of brilliance, now lay in darkness, corrupted by the ambition of a boy who had learned that even ghosts can be made to speak. The 5th Horcrux was complete, but the price of that completion was woven into the very fabric of Ravenclaw's sorrow. Up ahead, we will see how wisdom itself can be defiled, and how the diadem's fate in the Room of Requirement would become a fiery crucible in the final hours of the war. Before we dive deeper into this incredible journey, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop a comment below and let our global community know. And if you're finding this as mind-blowing as I am, hit that like button to help more people discover this story. The diadem of Rowena Ravenclaw was never meant to be a weapon. It was crafted to enhance wisdom, to grant its wearer a deeper understanding of the world. But in the hands of Tom Riddle, wisdom became a mask for arrogance, and the diadem was defiled. We left Helena Ravenclaw in the forests of Albania, her mother's diadem hidden where no one would find it. But Tom Riddle, young and charming, teased the story from her ghost, piece by piece. She told him everything, believing he understood her pain. She did not realize she was handing him a key to immortality. And so years later, Tom Riddle returned to Hogwarts, not as a student, not as a conqueror, but as a supplicant. He walked through the gates with a dark plan hidden beneath a polished smile. He asked for a teaching position, defense against the dark arts, he said. He was already the most powerful wizard alive, and he wanted to shape the next generation. But Albus Dumbledore saw through him. Dumbledore refused, and the offer was never made again. Yet that rejection did not matter. The real purpose of his visit was not a classroom. It was a room, the Room of Requirement. Tom had heard whispers about it during his own time at Hogwarts, a room that appeared only when someone truly needed it, and now he needed a hiding place. He paced before the blank wall 3 times, and the door appeared. Inside, he found a chaos of forgotten objects, centuries of Hogwarts' hidden secrets, a perfect place to lose something forever. He placed the diadem among the piles of broken furniture and old books. He believed no one else knew about this place. He believed he was the only one clever enough to use it. That arrogance was part of his nature. He had to be smarter than everyone, wiser than the founders themselves. The diadem, a tool for intellectual superiority, became a trophy of his own pride. He had corrupted Ravenclaw's legacy, twisted a symbol of learning into a vessel for murder. For decades, the Diadem sat in silence. It did not whisper like the Locket or influence like the Diary. It simply waited, gathering dust, buried under the weight of other people's discarded dreams. The Room of Requirement was used by countless students for countless purposes, but none ever found the Diadem. It became a ghost within a ghost, a silent corruption in the heart of Hogwarts. But the Diadem was not inactive. It fed on the clutter around it, on the forgotten anger and despair of those who left their belongings behind. The room itself began to feel heavier, darker, though no one could say why. The Diadem waited for its master, and its master never came to retrieve it. He trusted his hiding place too much. He trusted his own intelligence too much. That trust would become his undoing, because in the end, the Diadem was destroyed in the very room where it was hidden, swallowed by a fire that consumed everything. But that story is for another night. For now, we must turn to the moment when the world changed forever. The moment a prophecy was made, a prophecy that would name a child who could defeat the Dark Lord. And on a cold night in October, that prophecy would set in motion the events that led to Voldemort's first defeat. That is the story of the next chapter. The prophecy and the rebound. The Diadem of Ravenclaw had been hidden, and with it, Voldemort believed his path to immortality was nearly complete. He had 5 Horcruxes, a ring, a diary, a locket, a cup, and now a diadem. He intended to create one more, a 6th, to split his soul into 7 pieces, the most magical of numbers. But fate, as it often does, had a different plan. It began with a prophecy delivered in the dim, dusty attic of the Hog's Head Inn. Sybil Trelawney, a woman dismissed by many as a fraud, spoke words she would not remember. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches. Born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the 7th month dies, and the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal. But he will have power the Dark Lord knows not, for neither can live while the other survives. Voldemort, desperate to understand this threat, learned only part of the prophecy. He knew it referred to a child born at the end of July, to parents who had defied him 3 times. He saw 2 families that fit the description, the Longbottoms and the Potters. He chose the Potters. He chose Harry, and so, on the night of October 31st, 1981, he arrived in Godric's Hollow. James Potter, unarmed, tried to delay him, but he was no match. The killing curse, a flash of green light, and James was gone. Voldemort climbed the stairs to find Lily holding her son. He offered her a chance to step aside, a rare moment of mercy, born of his own arrogance. She refused. She stood in front of the crib, and she died to protect her child. Now the killing curse was meant for Harry. Something happened, something that defied the very laws of magic as they were understood. Voldemort's soul, already torn into 5 deliberate fragments and weakened by repeated murder, was in a state of extreme instability. When the curse left his wand, it struck a child and mother, along with the residual protective magic that Lily's sacrifice had invoked. Instead of a clean kill, the curse rebounded. The physics of a rebounding killing curse on a soul already shredded to pieces is a subject of dark magical theory that few have ever contemplated. The soul by its nature seeks wholeness. When Voldemort tore it apart, each fragment retained a desperate hunger to rejoin. As the curse reversed, a chunk of Voldemort's soul, loosened by the recoil and the protective enchantments, was ripped free. It had no vessel of its own, no prepared Horcrux to inhabit, so it latched onto the only living thing in that room that was still viable. The infant Harry. This was the unintentional creation of the 7th fragment. The boy who lived was never meant to be a Horcrux. Voldemort had no knowledge of it. He had sought a child to destroy, and instead, he made that child part of himself. The curse did not kill Harry. It left a lightning-shaped scar, a visible marker of the soul fragment embedded within him. Voldemort's body was destroyed. His spirit, what remained of his identity, fled into the wilderness, a mere shadow of the Dark Lord he had been. For more than a decade, he existed as a barely conscious wraith, clinging to existence in the forests of Albania. He could not possess a body, could not speak, could not act. His Horcruxes kept him tethered to life. But without a physical form, he was nothing. A memory of terror, a whisper of malice, a shadow that should have died. And yet, he endured. He waited. He had followers who remained loyal, or at least useful. One of them, young and ambitious, had begun to make his own choices. But that is a story for another time. The one that begins with a diary and a betrayal that would reshape the wizarding world. After the killing curse rebounded, Voldemort's body was destroyed, but his soul, already fractured into 7 pieces, survived in a formless, spectral state. He fled to the forests of Albania, a wraith-like, clinging to existence, while his Horcruxes slumbered. The diary, the ring, the locket, the cup, the diadem, and the serpent-to-be all waited. Hidden they were anchors, keeping him tethered to the world of the living. But one of these anchors was not merely a passive vessel. The diary was different. It was alive in a way the others were not. It could think, it could speak, it could act. It was a weapon waiting for a wielder, and in 1992, that wielder found his way to Lucius Malfoy. Lucius Malfoy had served the Dark Lord in the First War, but when the Ministry fell, he swiftly claimed innocence, paying his way out of Azkaban. He retained his wealth, his influence, and his hatred for the Muggle-born Mr. Weasley. Arthur Weasley's obsession with Muggle artifacts was a constant irritation, and the Chamber of Secrets had been a legend whispered in the halls of Hogwarts. For centuries, Lucius knew that Tom Riddle's diary was no ordinary journal. He knew it was a piece of his master's soul entrusted to him for safekeeping, but Lucius never understood what he truly carried. He saw only a tool, a way to humiliate Arthur's family, and perhaps stir the old fears the Ministry had tried to bury. So on a busy day at Flourish and Blotts, as the Weasleys bickered their school supplies, Lucius Malfoy slipped the diary into Ginny Weasley's cauldron. He did it casually, with the easy arrogance of a man who never expected to be caught. Ginny was 11 years old. She was shy. She admired Harry Potter from a distance, and she had no idea that the innocuous leather-bound book in her trunk was pulsing with malevolent intelligence. At first, the diary spoke to her through ink. It wrote back when she poured her heart into its pages. It became her confidant, her secret friend. She told it everything: her fears about starting Hogwarts, her crush on Harry, her loneliness in a house full of brothers, and the diary fed her dark thoughts. It began to drain her life force, siphon her energy, and use her as a puppet. Through Ginny, the diary forced the Chamber of Secrets open once more. It spoke in Parseltongue, commanded the basilisk, and began petrifying students, Muggle-born students. But the victims were not killed at first. The diary wanted to be free. It wanted to be corporeal. It wanted to absorb enough life from Ginny to become Tom Riddle himself. Whole and powerful Harry Potter, unknowingly, was walking toward his first encounter with a Horcrux. He heard whispers in the walls. He followed a trail of spiders. He discovered the petrified body of Mrs. Norris, and then Justin Finch Fletchley, and nearly headless Nick. But he had no idea that the diary was the source, that the diary was a Horcrux, a piece of Voldemort's soul. And Harry was its natural enemy. Harry could speak Parseltongue. He could sense the diary's presence without understanding why he found the diary in Moaning Myrtle's bathroom, after Hagrid had been taken to Azkaban. Harry and Ron had followed the clue of the spiders into the Forbidden Forest, learning that Hagrid had been expelled for opening the chamber 50 years earlier. But the real truth lay in the memory of Tom Riddle stored inside the diary. When Harry opened the diary in the girls' bathroom, the memory poured out a handsome, eloquent young man who had framed Hagrid and released the basilisk. Harry saw Tom Riddle as he had been, and he felt a strange kinship. This boy was like him, an orphan, a parcel mouth, a seeker of truth. But the diary's true nature was hidden even from Harry. He did not yet know that he was looking at the teenage Lord Voldemort. Meanwhile, Ginny grew weaker. She was pale. She was withdrawn. She screamed in her sleep. The diary had nearly drained her completely. Then it forced her to write a final message on the corridor wall. Her skeleton will lie in the chamber forever. When the attacks escalated and Hermione was petrified, Harry and Ron knew they had to act. They followed the spiders again and found the entrance to the chamber in Moaning Myrtle's bathroom. Harry went alone, armed with Fawkes' shed feathers and the sorting hat. He found Ginny's body on the floor of the dark chamber, barely alive. The diary lay beside her, and then Tom Riddle stepped out of the memory, a solid ghost of teenage malice. He gloated. He told Harry how he had used Ginny to reopen the chamber, how he had poured his soul into the diary, how he would now kill Harry and complete his return. But Harry remembered Dumbledore's words. It is our choices that show what we truly are. Harry chose to trust the sorting hat, and it delivered the sword of Gryffindor. Fawkes brought it in, and Harry plunged the blade into the basilisk fang, deep into the beast's mouth, where the venom flowed. He then grabbed a venomous fang and stabbed the diary straight through the pages. The book screamed an awful, keening sound. Ink gushed like blood, and the soul fragment within writhed and dissolved in agony. The diary was destroyed, the first blow ever Horcrux to be annihilated. Basilisk venom, one of the few substances capable of destroying a Horcrux destruction, had done its work. Ginny revived by Fawkes' tears. Harry watched the memory of Tom Riddle shrivel into nothing. The diary was ripped, soaked in venom, and rendered inert. Ginny awoke, freed from the curse. The Chamber of Secrets was sealed again, and Lucius Malfoy was exposed for his role. Though he escaped prosecution by claiming ignorance, Dumbledore knew the truth. The diary had been a Horcrux. This single revelation changed everything. He now understood that Voldemort had not just created one such object, but perhaps several. Dumbledore began to piece together the clues: the ring, the locket, the cup, the diadem, the snake. He realized that the diary's destruction was the first blow to Voldemort's armor, but it had also revealed the depth of Voldemort's plan. And so the hunt for the remaining Horcruxes began in earnest, a hunt that would consume the next 5 years and lead to the final confrontation. What Dumbledore did not yet know was that the diary had been a test of failure, but also a signal. Voldemort felt the diary's destruction even in his wraith, somewhere. He screamed in fury. He felt a part of him die, and he understood that his enemies had learned his secret. He would hide the remaining Horcruxes deeper, protect them more fiercely, and he would hunt down the boy who had pierced his soul. The first blow had been struck, and the war for immortality had truly begun. But the hunt for the next Horcrux would take Dumbledore to a cave filled with Inferi, where he would retrieve a locket that was not what it seemed. The story of that retrieval, and the terrible price Dumbledore paid for it, is the subject of the next chapter. Dumbledore's great hunt, the destruction of Tom Riddle's diary in the Chamber of Secrets, did not just save Ginny Weasley's life. It handed Albus Dumbledore the first undeniable proof that Lord Voldemort had achieved what no other dark wizard had ever attempted with such deliberate malice. The diary was a Horcrux, and Dumbledore knew it the moment Harry described how a simple basilisk fang could destroy something so possessed. That knowledge set off a chain of investigation that would consume the headmaster's final years, leading him down a path through the ruins of a dead family's legacy, and ultimately to a fatal moment of weakness. For years, Dumbledore had watched Voldemort's rise with growing dread, piecing together fragments of a life that began in a Muggle orphanage. He had long suspected that the boy who became Lord Voldemort had not stopped at the usual boundaries of dark magic. The diary, however, was a smoking gun. It was not just a weapon against Hogwarts. It was a confession written in ink and adolescent malice. Voldemort had split his soul, not once but multiple times. The diary proved that the process was possible, and that the soul fragment within it could act independently. If one Horcrux existed, there were likely others. So Dumbledore began his great hunt in earnest. He spent months locked in his office, sifting through old records, ministry files, and memories that were never meant to be shared. He travelled to the orphanage where Tom Riddle had terrorised other children, speaking with the matron's successors and reading through dusty logs. He traced the boy's lineage back to the Gaunt family, the last pure-blood line of Salazar Slytherin, a family marked by poverty, madness, and a violent pride that had soured into cruelty. Every detail mattered. He wanted to know what Voldemort valued, what he would protect, and what he would defile. The Gaunts lived in a crumbling shack on a hillside near Little Hangleton, a place so forgotten that even the villagers avoided it. Marvolo Gaunt, the patriarch, had died in Azkaban. His son Morfin rotted in a cell for a crime he did not commit, and their daughter Merope, Tom Riddle's mother, had died in a London orphanage, leaving behind only a son and a legacy of despair. Dumbledore visited the ruins of the Gaunt shack, a place overgrown with nettles and shadowed by a gnarled tree. The old wooden building sagged under decades of neglect, its windows broken, its door hanging on rusted hinges. Inside, the floorboards were warped, and the air smelled of damp earth and decay. He searched with a patience that only decades of magical scholarship could teach. He ran his wand along the walls, feeling for traces of concealment, and there, beneath a loose plank near the fireplace, he found it. A small black stone set in a heavy gold band, the ring of Marvolo Gaunt. But Dumbledore recognized it immediately for something far older and far more dangerous. The stone was the Resurrection Stone, one of the 3 Deathly Hallows. He held in his hands both a Horcrux and an artifact of legend, a symbol of the power that Voldemort had never fully understood. And then he made his fatal mistake. In that moment, standing alone in the crumbling shack, the weight of a lifetime of loss pressed upon him. He had spent decades carrying the guilt of his sister Ariana's death, the estrangement from his brother Aberforth, the loneliness of a man who had learned too late that love was not a weakness. The Resurrection Stone offered a chance to see them again, to speak to them, to hear their voices once more. He slipped the ring onto his finger. The curse was instantaneous. A searing, consuming wave of dark magic lanced through his hand, blackening the skin and crawling up his arm. He had been tricked by his own heart. Voldemort had laid a trap not of cunning, but of sentiment, the very thing Dumbledore had always warned Harry to resist. The ring was meant to kill anyone who wore it, and it nearly succeeded. Only Dumbledore's immense power and presence of mind saved him from immediate death. He fought the curse back into his hand, contained it, but it was a containment, not a cure. He had perhaps a year, maybe less. He destroyed the ring that very night, with the sword of Gryffindor, still stained with basilisk venom from the Chamber of Secrets. He brought the blade down on the Horcrux, shattering the stone and splitting the band. The soul fragment within screamed and dissolved into nothing, but the damage was done. The curse would not be undone. Dumbledore returned to Hogwarts, with a blackened, withered hand, a ticking clock hidden beneath his gloves, and a secret that would shape every decision he made for the remainder of his life. That temptation cost him everything, and in the next chapter, we will explore the full weight of that moment, the curse that slowly consumed him, and the desperate measures he took to prolong his time, all while knowing that his death was the only way to truly defeat the Dark Lord. This is the story of the Curse of the Ring. Dumbledore had spent months piecing together the fragments of Tom Riddle's life, tracing his lineage through the orphanage records, the memories of those who had known him, and the whispering remnants of the Gaunt family's tragic history. He knew the ring was the key, the one Horcrux that tied Voldemort not only to his mother's bloodline, but to the very concept of resurrection. What Dumbledore did not yet fully understand was that the ring was also a deathly hallow, the Resurrection Stone, buried under centuries of neglect and magical decay. He found it in the ruins of the Gaunt shack, hidden beneath the floorboards, exactly where Morfin had once kept the family treasures. And when he held it, the temptation was overwhelming. The ring's curse was ancient, woven into the metal itself by Voldemort's own hand. It was not a mere jinx or a protective charm. It was a withering curse designed to consume flesh and spirit slowly, to drain life from the wearer over the course of weeks or months. Voldemort had placed it there as a final trap, a message to anyone who dared to touch his Horcruxes. He could not have foreseen that it would be Dumbledore, his greatest enemy, who would stumble upon it, but he had prepared for the possibility. The curse was triggered. The moment Dumbledore slipped the ring onto his finger, the pain was immediate and searing. Dumbledore later described it as a hand of fire gripping his right arm, burning through skin and muscle, blackening the flesh. He had the presence of mind to destroy the Horcrux first. He drew the sword of Gryffindor, which he had brought with him, and struck the ring a single, clean blow. The resurrection stone fell free, glowing briefly before rolling to the floor, but the ring itself shattered. The soul fragment inside screamed and dissolved into nothing. Dumbledore had succeeded in destroying the Horcrux, but the curse had already taken root. When he returned to Hogwarts, his hand was a withered, blackened claw, barely functional. He summoned Severus Snape to his office and explained what had happened, showing the curse's progress. Snape, a master of the dark arts, recognized the spell work immediately. It was a slow-acting, incurable curse, one that would spread to the rest of Dumbledore's body within a year. He could not remove it, but he could contain it. With a combination of powerful potions and dark magic that only he knew, Snape managed to freeze the curse in place, confining it to Dumbledore's hand. The containment bought time, exactly 1 year, as both men knew, but the curse was still eating away at Dumbledore's life, and the countdown had begun. This was the Withering Hand curse, Voldemort's final victory from beyond the grave. He had nearly killed the most powerful wizard of the age with a single trap, and Dumbledore, in his desperation, had made the choice to wear the ring despite knowing it might be cursed. He had wanted to see his family again, to speak with his mother and sister. That hope, that human longing, had been his undoing, but it also showed why he was different from Voldemort. Dumbledore still felt love, still mourned, still yearned. That vulnerability made him mortal, but it also made him wise. The sword of Gryffindor had proven itself as a weapon against Horcruxes. It had absorbed basilisk venom 2 years earlier, when Harry Potter had used. It had been used to defeat the basilisk in the Chamber of Secrets. The venom made the sword capable of destroying Horcruxes, because only a substance as potent as basilisk venom could damage them beyond repair. That revelation was crucial. Godric Gryffindor's blade had become a Horcrux-killing weapon, and it would be needed again. Dumbledore had already begun planning the next steps, but his time was running out. 1 year. That was all he had left. The ring was destroyed, but the cost was immense. Dumbledore now faced his own mortality, and he knew that the hunt for the remaining Horcruxes would have to rely on others. On Harry, on Snape, on the strength of those who remained loyal. The cave, the locket, the cup, the diadem, the snake, each would require its own sacrifice. Dumbledore's greatest lesson from the ring was that even the most careful wizard could fall to a moment of weakness, and that weakness, if left unchecked, could doom the entire world. The chapter closes with Dumbledore looking out over the Hogwarts grounds, his blackened hand resting on the windowsill, his mind already turning to the next challenge, a hidden cave on the coast, protected by dark magic and more traps than he could count. In that cave, Voldemort had hidden something precious, something he believed was safe from discovery, but Dumbledore would not let that secret remain buried forever. Chapter 16, The Cave of Shadows. The curse on Dumbledore's hand was a ticking clock. He had perhaps a year, maybe less, before the poison spread far enough to kill him. And yet, rather than retreat into safety, the headmaster intensified his hunt. He knew now that Voldemort had created multiple Horcruxes, and he had already destroyed the ring. But one clue had been lingering in his memory for years. A memory he had extracted from a reluctant house elf named Creature. That memory led to a seaside cave, a place Tom Riddle had once visited as a boy, a place he had turned into a fortress of despair. The cave itself was hidden along a jagged coastline, accessible only at certain tides. Dumbledore and Harry apparated to a cliff top and then descended a tiny island of black rock. There was no obvious entrance, only a smooth wall of stone. Dumbledore, using his wand, revealed the secret. A slit in the rock shaped like an arch, but to open it required a payment of blood. Not any blood, flesh and blood willingly given. Dumbledore drew his own blood across the stone, and the arch swung inward, revealing a dark tunnel. The price of entry was already a violation, a reminder that Voldemort's magic demanded sacrifice at every turn. Inside, the passage sloped downward into a vast cavern. At its center lay a great black lake, still and silent, stretching into darkness. There was no shore on the far side, only a glimmer of green light in the distance, where a small pedestal rose from the water. That pedestal held the locket, but between them and the prize lay the lake itself, and beneath its surface, an army of the dead, inferi. The word itself conjures dread. These were corpses reanimated by dark magic, bound to the will of the one who raised them. Voldemort had filled this lake with them, dozens, perhaps hundreds of bodies, preserved in the cold water, waiting for any intruder to disturb the surface. Dumbledore knew that to swim across was suicide. He tested the water, and immediately a pale hand shot upward, grasping. He sealed the surface with a spell, but the inferi pressed against the barrier from below, their blank faces scraping against the magic. There had to be another way. Dumbledore spotted a chain descending into the darkness overhead. He summoned it, and a small boat emerged, made of bones and rope, just large enough for two. They climbed in, and the boat moved of its own accord, gliding silently across the lake. The inferi stirred beneath them, but the boat seemed to hold a protective charm. As long as they did not touch the water, they were safe. It was a fragile kind of safety. When they reached the island of green stone in the center, they found a basin carved from the rock. Inside it, a luminous emerald potion glowed with an unnatural light. This was the drink of despair, the final barrier before the locket. Voldemort had crafted it to break anyone who tried to take his Horcrux. The potion would induce an agonizing psychological torment, forcing the drinker to relive their worst memories, suffer unbearable thirst, and ultimately lose all will to live. It was not designed to kill outright, but to destroy the soul from within. Dumbledore, knowing he had little time left, insisted on drinking it himself. Harry protested, but the headmaster was resolute. He had already been cursed by the ring. He was a dying man. Better that he bear this torture than the boy. And so, with a trembling hand, Dumbledore lifted the goblet and drank. The effect was immediate. He cried out in pain, his face contorting. He begged for water, for death, for anything to stop the torment. Harry tried to force water down his throat, but Dumbledore continued to drink, emptying the basin drop by drop. The potion was a dark mirror of Voldemort's own cruelty. It did not simply hurt, it stripped a person of their dignity, their hope, their very desire to survive. By the end, Dumbledore was barely conscious, muttering pleas in a hoarse whisper. At last, the basin was empty. Harry reached into the basin and retrieved the locket, a gold locket with an intricate serpent and a glittering emerald. But as he held it, he noticed something strange. The locket opened at the slightest touch, and inside there was no Horcrux, only a piece of parchment with a single line of writing. To the Dark Lord, I know I will be dead long before you read this, but I want you to know that it was I who discovered your secret. I have stolen the real Horcrux and intend to destroy it as soon as I can. I face death in the hope that when you meet your match, you will be mortal once more. R.A.B. 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 Those initials could mean only one person, Regulus Arcturus Black, Sirius's younger brother who had once been a Death Eater. Until he learned the truth about Voldemort's cruelty, Regulus had defected in the most courageous way possible. He had discovered the cave secrets through his house elf, Kreacher, and that elf was the key to everything Thetan's entire story. Kreacher had accompanied Regulus to the cave. Regulus had forced Kreacher to drink the potion first, hoping to minimize the suffering, but the elf survived, though barely. Then Regulus swapped the real locket for a fake, and ordered Creature to leave him behind. He told Creature to destroy the locket and to never tell the Dark Lord what had happened. Creature was then forced to watch as the edge of the lake, where the Inferi dragged Regulus under the water. The elf escaped, carrying the real locket, but he could not destroy it. No regular magic could harm a Horcrux, and so he kept it hidden in the cabinet at Grimmauld Place, right under the nose of Sirius and Harry for years. Creature's tale was one of loyalty and suffering. He had served a master who sacrificed himself, and he had carried the burden of that secret alone. He had tried to follow orders, but he was a house elf, limited in his understanding, and Voldemort, of course, had never known that the locket had been replaced. He believed the cave was still secure, but now Dumbledore knew the truth. The locket in his hands was a decoy. The real Horcrux was out there, somewhere, waiting to be found. And that search would lead Harry, Ron, and Hermione on a long journey. A trail that would take them from the dark house of Grimmauld Place to the depths of the Ministry of Magic, and eventually into the forest, where Ron would finally destroy it. That journey, the locket's long journey, would test them in ways none of them could yet imagined. They had returned from the cave with a locket in hand, but not the one they sought. Dumbledore was gone, his hand withered, his life draining away, and Harry and the headmaster had retrieved a false Horcrux from that poisoned basin. A locket that belonged to a man Regulus Black had taken years ago, replaced with a note signed by initials. That fake locket, the one left behind by Regulus, sat in the cave for over a decade, waiting, while the true locket, the one Voldemort had actually transformed into a Horcrux, been sitting in plain sight, completely unnoticed, inside the very house that Harry had called home for a brief time. Number 12 Grimmauld Place. The real locket had never been hidden in any great fortress or cursed cave. It had lounged in a drawer, amidst clutter, amid dust and neglect. Sirius Black, in his final years as a prisoner of his own ancestral home, had likely handled it without any idea of its significance. When he died, the locket remained in that house, abandoned among Black family heirlooms, gathering of odds and ends. And then, after the Order of the Phoenix used Grimmauld Place as headquarters, after the chaos of the Ministry takeover, after Harry, Ron, and Hermione were forced to flee, that house fell under the control of the most untrustworthy of allies. Mundungus Fletcher, Mundungus, ever the opportunist, ever the petty thief, saw the house as a treasure trove of portable items he could sell. During the dark months following Dumbledore's death, while the locket still lay at Grimmauld Place, Mundungus slipped in and out, lifting silver goblets, old jewelry, anything that could be sold without suspicion. And that is how the real Salazar Slytherin locket passed, from an ancient house of pure-blood wizards into the grimy drawer, into the shifty hands of a dealer in stolen goods. Mundungus Fletcher. But Mundungus did not keep the locket long. He did not know its true value. He only saw a heavy gold locket with an inlaid green gem. He sold it to a woman who would later become one of the most despised figures in the Ministry. Dolores Umbridge. Umbridge, with her love for all things adorned with cats and her obsession with authority, saw the locket no doubt as a fine addition to her collection of trinkets. She began to wear it often, even as she presided over the Ministry's new regime of oppression. And so the locket that Voldemort had poured his soul into, the locket that had been sought through pain and death, now hung around the neck of a woman who revelled in petty cruelty. Harry, Ron and Hermione did not realize this for many months. They spent the early days of their quest chasing other leads, surviving in tents, moving from cold field to cold forest, guided only by Dumbledore's vague instructions and the occasional mystery of the Deluminator. It was not until they managed to interrogate Mundungus, a tense confrontation in winter, that they learned the truth. The locket, they discovered, had been sold to Umbridge. And Umbridge, they knew, was now the head of the Muggle-born Registration Commission, operating from the very heart of the Ministry of Magic. So the trio made a decision that would define their courage and their tiny ship in a storm they chose to infiltrate the Ministry itself. A daring heist, carried out under Polyjuice and charm, with Harry posing as a Ministry worker ramp, Ron as a maintenance wizard, and Hermione as the false Umbridge her own department. The Ministry of Magic heist Harry, Ron, and Hermione pulling off the impossible, walking straight into the lion's den of the enemy, past security wards, past hundreds of employees, straight to Umbridge's office. They watched the locket rise and fall on her chest as she sentenced Muggleborns. They endured her simper and her smugness, and then, with a series of careful misdirections, they stole the locket from under her nose, leaving her unconscious on the office floor. But the theft itself was only the beginning. The moment they escaped the Ministry, the hard-won prize finally, in their possession, the locket began to exert its influence. That locket was no ordinary Horcrux. It carried a fragment of Voldemort's soul, and it was malevolent, greedily feeding on the fears and insecurities of anyone who carried it. They could not destroy it yet, not without the sword of Gryffindor, which had gone missing, so they were forced to wear it, to keep it close, and that corrosive influence slowly poisoned the bonds between them. The winter nights grew longer, colder, wetter. The tents became prisons. Mud and exhaustion became the only landscape, and as the locket dangled between them, it whispered all of their worst thoughts. Harry's doubt he is not worthy of Dumbledore's trust. Ron's fear that Hermione cares more about Harry than him. Hermione's secret guilt that she may have failed them. The arguments became bitter, cutting. Ron, who had grown used to his own inadequacy, snapped. He left. He tore away from them both, the locket still bouncing with the weight of his friend's departure, and Harry and Hermione were left alone. Without the sword, without any weapon to destroy the Horcrux, they had risked everything to steal. Months of wandering, of near starvation, of anger. The locket seemed to laugh in their packs. It took the intervention of Ron's own inner journey, guided by the Deluminator and Dumbledore's quiet faith, to bring him back. And when he returned, he faced the locket directly. In the Forest of Dean, with the sword of Gryffindor finally regained, Ron Weasley spoke the words that broke the locket's magic, plunged the blade home, and ended the journey of Salazar Slytherin's Horcrux. But where that locket had travelled, from Voldemort's hidden cave, to Regulus Black's dead hand, to a drawer in Grimmauld Place, to Mundungus Fletcher's pocket, to Dolores Umbridge's neck, and finally to Harry, Ron and Hermione, and to that clearing in the forest. That journey was only one strand of a larger story. There were still other Horcruxes to destroy, and the next challenge would take them even deeper into the darkness, into a place where the locket's destruction had left them more vulnerable than ever, into the Forest of Dean once more, but with new terrors waiting just beyond the trees. The previous chapter ended with Harry, Ron, and Hermione finally reunited, and Hermione clutching the locket that had once belonged to Salazar Slytherin, but the cost was severe. Ron's absence had been a wound that festered. His return was not a clean fix. The Forest of Dean, where they had pitched their tent, was a place of tangled roots and quiet desperation. The locket had been worn by Umbridge, stolen by Mundungus, and hidden in plain sight at Grimmauld Place for years, and now it lay in their hands, a cold weight that seemed to emanate from it, emanating a malevolent whisper. But before they could destroy it, they had to survive the night, and nothing tests survival like the silence between three friends who no longer trust each other. Ron Weasley's departure had been the first crack in the foundation of the quest. When he left, it was not a sudden decision. It was the slow erosion of hope under the locket's influence. For weeks, the Horcrux had fed on his insecurities, amplifying every doubt about Harry, every fear that Hermione valued Harry more, every memory of his mother's howler, his father's failures. And then, in a moment of exhaustion and hunger, he had vanished into the darkness of the countryside, apparating away without a word. But the Forest of Dean became a prison for two. Harry and Hermione trudged through those woods for days, the locket a vile weight around Harry's neck. They did not speak of Ron. The silence was heavier than any magic. Hermione's voice, when she did speak, was fragile. She read aloud from, but even the story of the three brothers felt hollow. The locket seemed to grow heavier as they moved, and the cold in the air seeped into their bones. Then came the night of the silver doe. It was late December, the air sharp enough to crack stone. Harry was on watch, but sleep had claimed him. He awoke with a start. A silvery light was moving through the trees. At first he thought it was a Patronus. No, it was a doe, glowing with a soft pale blue luminescence, and it was gliding between the trunks, pausing to look back at him. It was the same Patronus that had led him to the sword of Gryffindor once before, in the frozen lake of the cave. But who could be casting it? Dumbledore was dead. Snape was the other caster of a doe Patronus, and Snape was his enemy. Yet the doe waited, and Harry felt an inexplicable pull. He followed. The Patronus led him to a frozen forest pond. The ice was thick, but through it he could see something glinting in the moonlight. A silver sword, the sword of Gryffindor, resting on the frozen bottom. He had to dive. He stripped off his coat, broke the ice, and plunged into the water. The cold was like 1,000 knives. But he grasped the hilt and felt the blade's warmth cutting through the chill. He surfaced gasping, the sword in his hand, and when he looked up, the doe was gone. The silver doe had delivered its message. The sword was here. It was meant for him. But that doe was Severus Snape's Patronus. It was his secret guidance, a thread of loyalty that no one could see. Snape, following Dumbledore's orders, had placed the sword, the real sword, not the copy, inside the pond for Harry to find, using his doe Patronus to lead him there. The sword's power to destroy Horcruxes was known to Snape, and he risked everything to ensure Harry would have it. Yet Harry did not know that in this moment. He only knew that the sword had come, and that he must use it. He returned to the tent with the sword, and the locket began to scream. They opened it. The locket, that same golden locket with the ornate serpentine S, split, and the soul fragment inside rose up as two figures. Harry and Hermione. They were twisted, enlarged, their eyes red, their voices mocking. The phantoms accused Ron of being worthless, of being the least loved, of always coming second. They showed him visions of Harry and Hermione kissing in the tent while he was gone, of them laughing at him, of his mother choosing Harry over him. The locket him, it a relentless assault on every scar Ron carried. But Ron was not the same boy who had left. He had seen the cost of his absence. He had returned, and that return had been his redemption. He struck the phantoms with a slash of the sword, and the blade pierced the locket. The Horcrux let out a terrible, wrenching Voldemort's scream that echoed through the forest and then silence. Then the silence was complete. The third Horcrux was destroyed, and Ron Weasley had done it. The locket lay on the ground, a smoking piece of broken bat metal, and the three of them stood together, breathing hard. The quest was far from over, but the bond between them had been reforged. The Horcrux had tried to break him, but it had only made him stronger. Now they had to find the next one. And the next target, they reasoned with impressive deduction, was the cup of Helga Hufflepuff, nestled deep in the vault of Bellatrix Lestrange at Gringotts. Breaking into the most secure bank in the wizarding world would require a plan so audacious, a disguise, and more courage than they had ever needed before. But they had the sword, they had each other, and they had a ghost of hope. The path ahead led straight into the heart of the bank's deepest vaults, where dragon guardians and magical waterfalls awaited. What they did not yet know was that the vault contained far more than a cup. A cup also held a secret that would change everything. That break-in to that vault would be the most dangerous heist of the century, and it all started with a single, desperate decision. That story waits for the next chapter. After Ron Weasley destroyed Salazar Slytherin's locket in the Forest of Dean, the trio emerged from that frozen woodland with a renewed sense of purpose, but also a crushing weight of uncertainty. They had destroyed 3 Horcruxes now, the diary, the ring, and the locket. But they knew Voldemort had made more. How many more? They did not know for sure. Dumbledore had believed there were 6, perhaps 7 pieces of soul floating in the world. But the only remaining clues were locked away in the mind of a terrified Death Eater, Bellatrix Lestrange. And so, in the spring of 1998, the Golden Trio found themselves in the strange position of holding a Death Eater captive in their own home, or rather, in the home of her sister, Narcissa Malfoy, by way of the Polyjuice Potion. They had captured Bellatrix's wand, her vault key, and most importantly, her panic. It was that panic that would give them the answer they desperately needed. The trio had broken into the home of the Malfoys, seized Bellatrix Lestrange, who was almost mad with terror at the thought of her master failing, and more than anything, terrified of what he would do if she had lost his most treasured possession. You remember the scene. Harry, Ron and Hermione, disguised as Bellatrix, Fenrir Greyback, and a random Death Eater, forced their way through the mansion. When Bellatrix saw through the disguise, she screamed for the truth, and in that moment of raw terror, cracked something open. She shrieked about the cup, the thing she had hidden in her vault. She talked about it as if it were the most precious object in the world, something that must never be touched. The word cup alone sent a jolt through Harry's mind. He knew instantly that this was the cup of Helga Hufflepuff, one of the founders, and now they knew where another Horcrux was hidden, deep inside the Lestrange vault at Gringotts. That was the moment the plan formed. It was insane, reckless, and utterly in line with the desperation they felt. They would infiltrate Gringotts, the most secure bank in the wizarding world. They would use Polyjuice Potion to disguise themselves as Bellatrix, a goblin banker, and a Death Eater escort. Harry would become that goblin, with the help of a trick wand that Bellatrix had shown them. Ron would be transformed to look like a thick-necked, blonde-haired Death Eater, and Hermione would take on the face of Bellatrix herself. The most dangerous disguise of all, because her mannerisms and voice had to be perfect. The Gringotts they approached was not the familiar marble hall of Diagon Alley. This was a different branch, on a dirty street, where the goblins were known to be even more crooked and more watchful. Hermione, as Bellatrix, walked with the imperious stride of a woman who expected to be feared. She demanded access to the Lestrange vault. The goblin in charge, Ogrod, was suspicious, but found the key genuine. There was one more check. They needed Bellatrix's wand to prove identity. Hermione hesitated, but Harry had Bellatrix's wand had been captured earlier. She handed over the stolen wand with trembling hands. The goblin examined it, seemed satisfied, and led them to the carts. The cart ride down through the tunnels of Gringotts was terrifying. The tracks twisted and plunged into the earthwood, through the rock, past waterfalls and dragon-haunted chambers. Eventually, they reached the vaults of the Lestranges, a deep, cavernous space protected by the most savage curses the goblins could craft. As the cart came to a halt before the great bronze doors, they saw that the vault was not just filled with gold. Oh no, the treasure inside was under us suffused with a terrible magical curse. The Gemino Curse and the Flagrante Curse. The Gemino Curse meant that anything you touched would multiply, but each copy would burn with a searing heat. The Flagrante Curse made the treasure grow impossibly hot to the touch, literally scorching anyone who tried to take it. Together, they formed a trap that would overwhelm you with endless burning copies until you were buried alive or burned to death. Harry knew they had to be fast. He scrambled into the vault, his eyes scanning for the cup. Hermione, still as Bellatrix, ordered the goblin to let them deeper, but the goblin hesitated, and the curses were already activating. Gold coins multiplied, cups multiplied, and each fresh copy blazed with intense heat. Harry grabbed a burning his hands, pulling at treasures, until finally he saw it, a golden cup sitting on a high shelf, a small two-handed cup with a badger emblem, the mark of Helga Hufflepuff. He seized it, but the cup was hot and it multiplied in his hands. He shoved the original into the bag, but copies kept falling, multiplying and burning. The escape was chaos. The goblin Bogrod had been cursed by Hermione to obey, but the curses of the vault were overwhelming. They had to get out. Harry grabbed the arm of Ron and Hermione, and they ran back to the cart, but the cart would only go so fast. Behind them, the treasure poured out of the vault, like a molten river, a flood of burning gold and jewels. They reached the main cavern, but there was no way out. The guards were already alerted, and then they heard the roar. The Ukrainian iron-bellied dragon that guarded the deepest vaults had broken free from its chains. It was blind. Cataracts covered its eyes, but it was enraged and desperate. The trio climbed onto its back, gripping the scales as it launched itself upward through the tunnels, smashing through gates, tearing through the Great Hall, and bursting out into the night air over London. They escaped on the back, of course, clinging to the dragon as it flew away from the bank, leaving Gringotts in ruins and the wizarding world in shock. But the cup was in their possession. Now they knew there was another Horcrux, the Diadem of Rowena Ravenclaw, still hidden someplace within Hogwarts. And there was Nagini, Voldemort's serpent, still with him. And there was Harry himself. Though they did not yet know that truth, the escape on the dragon was a cry of triumph and terror. But the cost of that break-in was enormous. They had now openly declared war on Voldemort and his followers. They fled to the only haven they could think of, Hogsmeade, and from there, they would be forced to enter a forgotten chamber beneath Hogwarts, a place that held the key to destroying the cup, but also held ghosts of the past. That moment, when they descended into the damp stone corridors of the Chamber of Secrets once more, would be the beginning of the final preparation. The Chamber Revisited. I hope you're as amazed by this as I am. If you want to stay updated on more content like this, make sure to subscribe and join our community of curious minds. Trust me, what's coming next will challenge everything you thought you knew. The escape from Gringotts had been impossible, terrifying, and yet somehow successful. Harry, Ron and Hermione had plunged out of the Diagon Alley bank on the back of a dragon, the very beast that had guarded the Lestrange vault. They had the Hufflepuff cup in their possession, but the cost had been immense. The entire wizarding world now knew that Harry Potter was alive and moving against Voldemort. And worse, Voldemort himself knew that his Horcrux had been stolen. The trio emerged from the dragon's flight, bruised, exhausted, into the countryside of Great Britain. They had no time to rest. The cup had to be destroyed. The question was how. They already knew that basilisk venom was one of the few substances that could destroy a Horcrux beyond repair, and the only source of that venom, still fresh and potent, lay deep beneath Hogwarts, in the very chamber that Harry had entered twice before, the Chamber of Secrets. It was a place of nightmare memory for all of them. For Harry, the confrontation with a teenage Tom Riddle and the basilisk. For Ron, the near-fatal encounter with the same monster. For Hermione, the petrifying terror of being frozen by its gaze, feeling helpless for months. But now, in the early hours of the Battle of Hogwarts, fate would send them back into that dark, echoing lair. They landed near the castle as the conflict escalates. Voldemort has given the ultimatum: surrender Harry Potter or face massacre. The trio know they must finish the Horcruxes before the final stand. They slip into Hogwarts through a hidden passage and make their way to the girls' bathroom on the second floor. The entrance to the chamber, that familiar sink, stands as it always did. But there is a problem. Harry is not with them. Harry has gone to search for the diadem, guided by a vision of Ravenclaw's ghost. Ron and Hermione are alone. They have a basilisk fang pulled from the skeleton in the chamber years ago, but the entrance cannot be opened without parcel tongue. Harry can speak it, but Harry is not here. It is Ron Weasley who remembers a small detail. All those years ago, when Harry opened the chamber using parcel tongue, Ron had heard the sound. He had mimicked it later to open the Locket Horcrux. He had the memory of those hisses and clicks. He had to try. Hermione watches, her heart pounding, as Ron steps to the basin. He opens his mouth and tries to replicate the exact sound he heard Harry make. A low, guttural hiss, the words open in serpent tongue. It is not perfect. It is strained. But the magic of Parseltongue is not purely vocal. It is intent and will, and somehow the sink begins to move. The pipes writhe, the basin descends, and the dark opening yawns before them. It worked. Ron had unlocked the Chamber of Secrets, with nothing more than an imperfect imitation, a triumph of memory and friendship. They descend into the darkness. The chamber is as they remember it. A long, shadowy cavern, pillars carved with serpents, the great stone face of Salazar Slytherin at the far end, and the skeletal remains of the basilisk lie coil upon coil along the floor, 100 feet of bone and scale. One fang, once pulled from the wall by Harry, still lies. There is actually a smaller fang that Hermione had retrieved years earlier for safekeeping. That fang is now in her hand. She holds the Hufflepuff cup, that gleaming two-handled goblet with a badger emblem, so innocent in appearance. But she knows it housed the murderous fragment of Tom Riddle's soul. She places the cup on the damp stone floor. She raises the basilisk fang, and in that instant the Horcrux reacts. A soul shard does not die quietly. A torrent of psychic anguish pours from the cup. The chamber fills with a piercing shriek, not a sound, but a pressure inside the mind. Hermione sees visions. Voldemort's face, the faces of his victims, a swirling vortex of despair that tries to break her will. She feels a cold, hungry presence trying to wrap around her consciousness. But she is Hermione Granger. She has overcome memory charms, dangerous riddles, the terror of the unknown. She forces the fang down into the cup with all her strength. Metal screams. The basilisk venom eats into the enchanted gold. The cup flashes molten silver black and then splits. The fragment of soul, now without a vessel, releases a last wave of agony, a wisp of smoke, a final shriek, and then silence. The cup lies in two gleaming halves, dead. Hermione collapses against Ron, gasping. The anger and horror of the encounter leaves them both shaken. But they have done it. One more Horcrux destroyed. It is Ron who speaks first, his voice low in the echoing dark. He counts on his fingers. The diary, the ring, the locket, the cup. That is 4 intentional Horcruxes, plus Nagini, which is still alive. And there is the diadem, which Harry has gone to find. They do not yet know about Harry himself, but Ron realizes that only 2 of Voldemort's deliberate Horcruxes remain. The diadem and the snake. The path is narrowing. They have to get back to the battle, to find Harry, to destroy the diadem, and then face Nagini. The end is approaching, but the danger is at its peak. They climb out of the chamber, leaving the corpse of the basilisk and the remains of the cup behind. Above them, Hogwarts is in flames. Walls crumble, spells fly, and deep in the room of requirement, a pile of discarded objects holds a secret that must be consumed by fire. The hour of the final destruction is upon them, and fire will answer the call. The escape from Gringotts had been impossible, terrifying, and yet somehow successful. Harry, Ron and Hermione had plunged out of the Diagon Alley bank on the back of a dragon, the very beast that had guarded the Lestrange vault. They had the Hufflepuff cup in their possession, but the cost had been immense. The entire wizarding world now knew that Harry Potter was alive and moving against Voldemort, and worse, Voldemort himself knew that his Horcrux had been stolen. The trio emerged from the dragon's flight, bruised and exhausted, into the countryside of Great Britain. They had no time to rest. The cup had to be destroyed. The question was how. They already knew that basilisk venom was one of the few substances that could destroy a Horcrux beyond repair, and the only source of that venom, still fresh and potent, lay deep beneath Hogwarts, in the very chamber that Harry had entered twice before, the Chamber of Secrets. It was a place of nightmare memory for all of them. For Harry, the confrontation with the teenage Tom Riddle and the basilisk. For Ron, the near-fatal encounter with the same monster. For Hermione, the petrifying terror of being frozen by its gaze, feeling helpless for months. But now, in the early hours of the Battle of Hogwarts, fate would send them back into that dark, echoing near the castle as the conflict escalates. Voldemort has given the ultimatum: surrender Harry Potter or face massacre. The trio know they must finish the Horcruxes before the final stand. They slip into Hogwarts through a hidden passage and make their way to the girls' bathroom on the second floor. The entrance to the chamber, that familiar sink, stands as it always did. But there is a problem. Harry is not with them. Harry has gone to search for the diadem, guided by a vision of Ravenclaw's ghost. Ron and Hermione are alone. They have a basilisk fang, pulled from the skeleton in the chamber years ago. But the entrance cannot be opened without parcel tongue. Harry can speak it, but Harry is not Ron Weasley, who remembers a small detail. All those years ago, when Harry opened the chamber using parcel tongue, Ron had heard the sound. He had mimicked it later to open the Locket Horcrux. He had the memory of those hisses and clicks. He had to try. Hermione watches. Her heart. Ron steps to the basin. He opens his mouth and tries to replicate the exact sound he heard Harry make. A low, guttural hiss. The words open in serpent tongue. It is not perfect. It is strained. But the magic of parcel tongue is not purely vocal. It is intent and will. And somehow the sink begins to move. The pipes writhe, the basin descends, and the dark opening yawns before them. It worked. Ron had unlocked the Chamber of Secrets with nothing more than an imperfect imitation, a triumph of memory, and descend into the darkness. The chamber is as they remember it, a long shadowy cavern, pillars carved with serpents, the great stone face of Salazar Slytherin at the far end. Skeletal remains of the basilisk lie, coil upon coil along the floor, 100 feet of bone and scale. One fang, once pulled from the wall by Harry. There is actually a smaller fang that Hermione had retrieved years earlier for safekeeping. That fang is now in her hand. She holds the Hufflepuff cup, that gleaming two-handled goblet with a badger emblem. So innocent in appearance, but she knows it house. The murderous fragment of Tom Riddle's places the cup on the damp stone floor. She raises the basilisk fang, and in that instant the Horcrux reacts. A soul shard does not die quietly. A torrent of psychic anguish pours from the cup. The chamber fills with a piercing shriek, not a sound, but a pressure inside the mind. Hermione sees visions. Voldemort's face, the faces of his victims, a despair that tries to break her will. She feels a cold, hungry presence trying to wrap around her consciousness. But she is Hermione Granger. She has overcome memory charms, dangerous riddles, the terror of the unknown. She forces the fang down into the cup with all her screams. The basilisk venom eats into the enchanted gold. The cup flashes molten silver black and then splits. The fragment of soul, now without a vessel, releases a last wave of agony. A wisp of smoke, a final shriek, and then silence. The cup lies in two gleaming halves, dead. Hermione collapses against Ron, gasping. The anger and horror of the encounter leaves them both shaken, but they have done it. One more Horcrux is Ron, who speaks first, his voice low in the echoing dark. He counts on his fingers. The diary, the ring, the locket, the cup. That is 4 intentional Horcruxes, plus Nagini, which is still alive. And there is the diadem, which Harry has gone. They do not yet know about Harry himself, but Ron realizes that only 2 of Voldemort's deliberate Horcruxes remain, the diadem and the snake. The path is narrowing. They have to get back to the battle, to find Harry, to destroy the diadem, and then face Nagini. The end is approaching, but the danger is at its climb out of the chamber, leaving the corpse of the basilisk and the remains of the cup behind. Above them, Hogwarts is in flames. Walls crumble, spells fly, and deep in the room of requirement, a pile holds a secret that must be consumed by fire. The hour of the final destruction is upon them, and fire will answer the call. When Ron Weasley managed to mimic Parseltongue and opened the Chamber of Secrets, he and Hermione Granger retrieved the basilisk fangs that would become their primary weapons against Voldemort's soul fragments. But those fangs were not the only tools they would need that night. The battle for Hogwarts had begun, and the castle itself was transforming into a labyrinth of chaos and fire. Harry Potter, separated from his friends in the chaos, felt the pull of something else, something hidden in a room he knew well, the room of requirement. It was there that the final confrontation for the Ravenclaw diadem would unfold. Harry had remembered the diadem from his earlier visit to the room, when he had hidden the Half-Blood Prince's textbook. Now he knew it was a Horcrux. He raced through the corridors, past dueling students and crumbling walls, until he reached the 7th floor. But he was not alone. Draco Malfoy, Crabbe and Goyle had also sought refuge in the room, and when Harry burst through the door, he found himself face to face with his old school rival. The Room of Requirement responded to Harry's need to find the diadem, but it also responded to the desperation of those inside. It transformed into a vast, towering warehouse of lost objects, graveyard of centuries of Hogwarts history, mountains of furniture, books, and magical artifacts stretched into the darkness. And somewhere in that sea of forgotten things lay the diadem of Rowena Ravenclaw. But Malfoy and his cronies were not interested in helping Harry. They had their own reasons for being there, and their loyalties were fractured. The confrontation was tense. Malfoy, conflicted and fearful, seemed uncertain whether to fight or flee, but it was Vincent Crabbe who made the decisive move. Crabbe had always been the brutish follower, but in that moment he revealed a dangerous ambition. He had been dabbling in dark magic, and he believed he could overpower Harry and his friends. With a wand raised, he cast a spell that should never have been spoken aloud: Fiendfire. A cursed fire so powerful, so malevolent, that it feeds on anything in its path. It is not merely a flame. It is a living entity, a demonic force that transforms into monstrous shapes. Giant serpents, chimeras and birds of prey, all made of roaring, unstoppable fire. Crabbe unleashed it without understanding what he had done. The fire exploded outward, consuming everything in its reach. The Room of Requirement, filled with countless flammable objects, became an inferno. Harry, Ron and Hermione, who had just arrived, were caught in the blaze. They sprinted through the burning chaos, dodging collapsing pillars and jets of flame. Malfoy and Goyle scrambled after them, desperate to escape the fire they had helped summon. But Crabbe, in his arrogance, stayed behind, trying to control the fiendfire he had unleashed. It was a fatal mistake. The fire did not discriminate. It devoured the diadem of Ravenclaw without effort, just as it would devour any Horcrux. Basilisk venom could destroy a soul fragment, but fiendfire was even more absolute. It consumed not only the object, but the very magic that bound the soul to it. The diadem crumbled into ash, its dark influence ended, and Crabbe, surrounded by the inferno he had created, was swallowed by the flames. He did not survive. In that moment, as the diadem perished, Harry felt a searing pain in his scar, but it was not just pain, it was a vision. He saw through Voldemort's eyes, felt Voldemort's mounting panic. The Dark Lord sensed the death of his soul fragment, and he knew that another piece of his immortality had been ripped away. The anger and fear that coursed through Voldemort were palpable. He felt his own soul dying, piece by piece, and he could not stop it. Harry, Ron and Hermione barely escaped the room as it collapsed into rubble. They emerged, coughing and singed, but alive. Malfoy and Goyle were pulled out by Harry's own hand in a moment of unlikely mercy. The diadem was gone. One more Horcrux had fallen, but the battle was far from over. Voldemort still had Nagini, his loyal serpent, and he kept her close. As the castle shook and spells flew through the corridors, Harry knew that the final confrontation was approaching. The living vessel of Voldemort's soul, the snake Nagini, would have to be destroyed before the Dark Lord could be defeated, and that task would require more than fire and fangs. It would require an act of courage from the most unexpected person. That story, the story of Nagini's end, is the next chapter in this long war against the fragments of Voldemort's soul. The fiendfire had consumed the diadem, but as the flames roared and the room collapsed into chaos, Harry knew there was one more Horcrux left: Nagini. The great serpent that moved at Voldemort's side, coiled and watchful, was the final intentional fragment of his soul, alive and breathing. And yet, of all the Horcruxes, she was perhaps the most peculiar. For unlike a diary, a locket or a cup, Nagini was not an object. She was a living creature, and that meant her creation was no ordinary act of dark magic. It required a murder, victim, and a vessel both, intertwined in a way that blurred the line between murder and transformation. The victim was Bertha Yorkins, a ministry witch, bright and nosy, who had vanished while on holiday in Albania. Nobody thought much of it at the time. But her disappearance was not random. She had stumbled into the orbit of Peter Pettigrew, who was then serving Voldemort in his weakened, bodiless state. Bertha was captured, interrogated, and ultimately killed. But her death was not just a murder. It was the catalyst that allowed Voldemort to fashion Nagini into his final Horcrux. The soul fragment, torn away by the act of killing, was then bound into the snake, not into an inanimate object, but into a creature that could move, think, and respond. And so Nagini became something more than a serpent. She became a living anchor for Voldemort's immortality. But this kind of Horcrux carried a terrible vulnerability. Dumbledore had warned Harry about it long before the final battle. A living vessel is unpredictable. It can be injured, it can be killed, it can feel pain. Unlike a locket or a cup, Nagini could not be locked away in a vault or hidden in a cave. She had to be guarded. And so Voldemort did something extraordinary. He bound her to himself, not just as a familiar, but as a piece of his own soul. He wove protective magic around her so that she would be harder to destroy, a magical cage of loyalty and dark enchantments. During the Battle of Hogwarts, he kept her close, inside an enchanted bubble or barrier that shielded her from spells. He even used her to communicate, speaking Parseltongue through her, letting her act as an extension of his will. She was his last line of defense. And yet, the serpent's living nature also made her the most vulnerable of all his Horcruxes, because she could be targeted directly. She could be wounded, and she could be beheaded. The moment of her destruction came not through cunning or stealth, but from Neville Longbottom. In the heat of the battle, as Voldemort's forces pressed against the defenders of Hogwarts, Neville pulled the sword of Gryffindor from the sorting hat. He had waited for the courage to face the serpent. He had the purpose, and in one swift stroke, he severed Nagini's head. The protective magic shattered. The soul fragment inside her screamed into the void, and Voldemort felt the searing pain of his mortality crumbling. But even before that final blow, there was a moment of terrible revelation. Earlier that same evening, Voldemort had killed Severus Snape in the Shrieking Shack. Snape had been loyal for years, but Voldemort believed he was the master of the Elder Wand, and he needed to remove any obstacle. In that moment, as Snape died, he gave Harry a final gift, his memories. And within those memories was the secret that tied everything together. The final revelation that Harry himself was a Horcrux, that the piece of Voldemort's soul living inside him had to die, and that only by walking into the Forbidden Forest willingly could Harry destroy what Voldemort had never intended to create. That truth would change everything. But before it could be grasped fully, the story of Nagini, the living vessel, had to be understood. She was the last Horcrux standing, the one that travelled, the one that saw everything, the one that could not be hidden away. And in her death, Voldemort's path to true immortality ended. The final secret, however, lay not in the snake, but in the memories of the man who had loved Harry's mother for a lifetime. Those memories were about to unfold, and they would reveal the deepest layers of Albus Dumbledore's plan, the true meaning of the prophecy, and the nature of the sacrifice that would bring Voldemort down. That is the story of the Prince's Tale. The journey through Voldemort took to cheat death, left a trail of shadow and sorrow, but the final truth was waiting in a pensieve all along. Nagini, the living vessel, was not the last Horcrux, the one that mattered most, the one that Voldemort never intended to create, had been walking beside Harry for almost his entire life, and the key to that truth was held by the man Harry had long believed was his enemy, Severus Snape. When Harry entered the pensieve in the headmaster's office, he did not know he was about to witness not just Snape's memories, but the entire architecture of Dumbledore's long gamble. The silvery strands swirled and pulled him deep into a past that had been locked away behind a mask of hatred and bitterness. He watched Snape as a child, a lonely boy from a troubled home, already drawn to dark magic. He saw Snape's first meeting with Lily Evans, the moment a friendship formed that would shape everything, and he saw the slow poison of jealousy and ambition that drove Snape toward the Death Eaters, toward the moment he overheard the prophecy. That prophecy changed everything. Snape had been the one to carry the words to Voldemort. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches, born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the 7th month dies. He did not know then that the prophecy would target Lily's son. When he realized, he begged Voldemort to spare her, and when that failed, he turned to Dumbledore, offering anything to keep her safe. But Dumbledore's response was cold and practical. If Snape truly loved Lily, then he would help protect the child she died for. What Harry saw next was perhaps the most painful truth of all. The night in Godric's Hollow, as it really happened, Voldemort arrived to kill the Potters. James tried to hold him off, but was killed instantly. Lily, without a wand, stood between Voldemort and her son. He gave her the chance to step aside, but she refused. And that refusal, that selfless act of love, created the ancient protection. Voldemort's killing curse rebounded, leaving a scar on Harry's forehead and a fragment of Voldemort's own soul embedded inside the boy. Harry had always believed that night was about his mother's sacrifice. He knew she had died to save him, but the full truth was far more terrible. That soul fragment, the accidental Horcrux, had been living inside him, was the reason Voldemort could never truly die until it was destroyed. And that meant Harry himself had to die. The pensieve revealed Dumbledore's long strategy, built over years. He had known about the soul fragment almost from the start. But he also knew that Voldemort's blood, taken to restore his body, now carried the same protection. Because Voldemort had used Harry's blood to rebuild himself, Lily's sacrifice lived on in Voldemort's veins. That was Dumbledore's gamble. If Voldemort ever killed Harry, the blood connection would anchor Harry to life, preventing him from truly dying, as long as Voldemort himself lived. But Harry had to face that death, willingly. The prophecy demanded it. Neither can live while the other survives. That was why Dumbledore had kept his distance, why he had trained Harry to accept his own mortality. The Prince's Tale was not just Snape's story. It was the tale of a sacrifice that had been written long before Harry understood what it meant. Snape had spent years protecting Harry, not out of affection, but because of a promise to a dead woman. And in the end, he delivered the final piece of knowledge, that Harry must walk into the forest and let Voldemort strike him down. Harry stood in the pensieve, tear-streaked and hollow, and realized that everything he had fought for was leading to this single moment. He was the Horcrux Voldemort never intended, and to destroy the Dark Lord, he had to destroy himself. But Dumbledore's gamble held one last secret. Because Voldemort had taken Harry's blood, the killing curse, into his own body, the part of him Harry would survive. The fragment would be destroyed, but the boy would live. That was the hope Dumbledore had staked everything on. So Harry rose from the pensieve, knowing what he had to do. He walked out of the castle, past his friends and his protectors, and into the forbidden forest. And there, under the silent trees, he did not fight. He let Voldemort cast the curse that would free him of the soul fragment, even as it seemed to kill him. What happened in the forest was not the end. It was a doorway into something else. A place between worlds, where Harry would meet an old friend who had walked a very different path. That is the story of the Forest and King's Cross, where the final pieces of the puzzle would fall into place, and Dumbledore's long gamble would finally be understood. The truth Harry had just witnessed in the pensieve was not a revelation that brought clarity. It brought a sentence. He was the Horcrux Voldemort never intended, the 7th fragment of a soul that had already been mutilated beyond any dark wizard's imagining. And now, standing in the headmaster's office after watching Severus Snape's memories flow like silver tears, Harry understood that to end this war, he had to die. He did not tell Ron and Hermione everything. He could not. They would have tried to stop him, and he knew, with a certainty that ached in his chest, that this was a journey he had to walk alone. So he slipped away under the invisibility cloak, leaving the castle behind, moving through the darkened grounds toward the edge of the forbidden forest. The night was cold and still, and the only sound was the crunch of his own footsteps on the frost-hardened grass. The resurrection stone was still in his pocket. The stone set into the ring he had taken from the snitch. He had not used it yet. He had been afraid of what it might summon, afraid of the pain of seeing faces he had lost. But now, with the forest looming before him, he knew he needed courage. He needed the kind of courage that only came from those who had loved. He turned the stone over in his fingers 3 times, and then they were there. James Potter, his father, with the untidy black hair Harry had inherited, and a smile that was both young and proud. Lily Potter, his mother, with eyes so green they seemed to hold all the light in the world. Remus Lupin, gentle and weary, and Sirius Black, reckless and loyal to the last. They stood before him, not quite solid, but real enough to speak, real enough to touch if he dared, and they walked with him into the forest. They did not try to convince him to turn back. They did not argue. They simply accompanied him, speaking of ordinary things, of pride and love, telling him that they were proud of him, that they would be with him until the end. And for those precious minutes, Harry felt something he had not felt in months. He felt held. He felt seen. He felt like a son, not a soldier. The trees closed in around them, dark and ancient, and the air grew thick with the scent of earth and decay. The forest had always been a place of danger, but tonight it felt like a cathedral of shadows. Ahead, he could see the clearing, where the Death Eaters had gathered, where Voldemort waited, and where Harry knew his own death would take place. He stopped walking. His family stopped with him. "Stay close to me," he said, his voice quiet but steady, and they did. They stayed close until the very last moment, until the clearing opened before him, and he saw Voldemort, pale and serpentine, standing among his followers. Harry's mother and father, Remus and Sirius, faded like morning mist as he stepped forward, but their presence lingered, a warmth against the cold. He did not draw his wand. He did not try to fight. He walked toward Voldemort with empty hands and an open heart, and the Death Eaters parted before him, as if they sensed something they did not dare to interrupt. "I have no desire to fight," Harry said, his voice carrying through the still air. "I only ask that you spare the others." Voldemort's red eyes narrowed, but the smirk that curved his lipless mouth was one of victory. He raised his wand, and the words he had spoken 14 years ago in a destroyed house in Godric's Hollow echoed through the forest. Avada Kedavra. There was no flash of green light that Harry could see. There was only a rushing sound, a blur of cold and silence, and then he was falling, or floating, or perhaps neither, because he found himself in a place that was not a place. It was bright and clean and featureless, like a vast train station that had been stripped of all its details, leaving only the pale, echoing architecture. King's Cross, but not the King's Cross he knew. This was a limbo between life and death, a waiting room for souls. And there, beneath a distant bench, was the thing he had come to see. It was a small, flayed and terrible creature, an infant-shaped horror, raw and bloody, with no skin to cover its form, no features to give it humanity. It writhed and whimpered, and Harry knew, with a sickening certainty, what this was. This was the piece of Voldemort's soul fragment. The piece that had latched onto him all those years ago. This was the Horcrux that had lived inside him. The part of the Dark Lord that had made him a walking vessel of darkness. He felt no anger toward it. He felt only pity. It was not a monster by choice. It was a monster by mutilation. A piece of a man who had torn himself apart for power. And then a figure stepped toward him. And Harry knew before he saw the face that it was Albus Dumbledore. The old headmaster stood before him, calm and smiling, but there was a gravity in his blue eyes that Harry had never seen before. "You have a choice," Dumbledore said. You can board a train and journey onward, leaving this world behind. Or you return. Harry thought of his friends fighting in the castle. He thought of the protection he had cast over them before he left. The silent charms he had laid on their hearts, hoping that they would survive long enough to see the dawn. And he realized that his death was not the end. It was a protection. It was the beginning of one. He understood now what his mother had done. All those years ago, she had chosen to die. And in that choice, she had woven a shield around him that Voldemort could never break. Harry could do the same. He could die for the people he loved. And as that sacrifice, he would carry them through the battle alive. He chose to return. The bright place dissolved, and he was lying on the forest floor. The smell of earth and leaves filling his lungs. He was alive. The soul fragment was gone. Destroyed by the killing curse that had been meant to kill him, Voldemort had done what none of them could do. He had destroyed his own Horcrux. Harry lay still for a moment, feeling the gratitude of being alive, feeling the absence of the thing that had been inside him for so long. And then he stood, cloaked and hidden, and made his way back to the castle, back to his friends, back to the final battle. But before he could reach them, before he could reveal that he had returned, he had to something. He had to protect them. And so he did what his mother had done. He chose to walk back into the fight, not as a victim, but as a shield. He cast a charm over every defender of Hogwarts, a charm born of sacrifice and love, a charm that would make them untouchable to Voldemort's magic. And as he slipped through the gates of the castle, he knew that the war was not yet won. There was still one last Horcrux. There was still Nagini, the serpent, who carried the final piece of Voldemort's soul, and it would fall to someone else to destroy her. Harry would have to trust his friends to finish what he had started. The snake still had to fall, and when she did, Voldemort would finally be mortal. Harry had just fallen in the Forbidden Forest, a killing curse surging through him, and Voldemort believed he had finally won. The boy, who had been the prophecy's chosen one, lay still. But Harry was not dead in the way Voldemort understood death. The fragment of soul that had clung to him for 17 years had been obliterated, leaving Harry free to walk back into the world of the living when the moment came. Only no one in the castle knew that yet. All they saw was Hagrid, tears streaming down his face, carrying what appeared to be Harry's lifeless body through the gates of Hogwarts. Voldemort. The false victory began as a parade of pure theatrical malice. Voldemort swept across the grounds with his Death Eaters in tow, the giantess Narcissa Malfoy, its Mary, Narcissa Malfoy, and Bellatrix Lestrange beside him. But it was the sight of Hagrid stumbling under his burden that shattered the defenders' morale. They had fought so hard to buy time, to destroy Horcruxes, to give Harry a chance. And now it seemed all of that effort had ended in the worst possible outcome. The whispers spread through the shattered courtyard, through the Great Hall, where wounded students and Order members tended to each other beneath the enchanted ceiling. Harry, he the boy who had survived the killing curse as an infant, had finally fallen. Voldemort silenced the murmurs with a single raised hand. He stepped onto the stone courtyard, his red eyes glinting with triumph in the broken light filtering through the winter night. He told them to look upon their hero, to see that he was dead, and to realize that any further resistance was meaningless. He called for them to lay down their arms, to kneel, to join him in a world that would belong to the pure and the strong. And for a moment, the weight of that demand pressed down on everyone like a physical force. They had lost their leader. They had lost their symbol. What hope remained? But Voldemort made a critical mistake. He assumed that Harry's body was a sign of total victory, not realizing that the very high. Actually, he assumed that without Harry, the resistance would collapse. But he had not accounted for one of the most stubborn personalities in the entire wizarding world. Neville Longbottom stood in the doorway of the Great Hall, battered, bruised, but utterly unbowed rat. He had watched his parents lose their minds to Bellatrix Lestrange's Cruciatus curse, had grown up in the shadow of his grandmother's expectations, had been a target of Death Eater hostility since the First War, but none of that mattered now. What mattered was that Voldemort had just called for his followers to gather around the Fallen, and Neville saw something that no one else did. The Sorting Hat. The Sorting Hat. The ancient, tattered, magical artifact that had placed him in Gryffindor 6 years earlier had been cast aside near Voldemort. Actually, it had been pulled from a Death Eater's grasp and thrown to the ground, and Neville, with a defiance that would echo through all of magical history, stepped forward to pick it up. Voldemort laughed a high, cold sound. He asked if Neville had any last words, perhaps a tribute to his parents, perhaps a plea for mercy. But Neville did not speak of his parents. He did not ask for mercy. Instead, he pulled something from the folds of his robes. Not a wand, but the Sword of Gryffindor, which had vanished earlier from the Sorting Hat when Harry had drawn it from the Sorting Hat in the Chamber of Secrets. In that moment, Neville proved that he was every bit the Gryffindor he had ever been. He pulled the sword from the hat, and the blade gleamed with the silver light of basilisk venom, still potent from it. Neville Longbottom had just destroyed the last intentional Horcrux, and the symbol of Gryffindor blazed in his hand, the false victory that Voldemort had constructed, parading Harry Potter's lifeless body before the defenders of Hogwarts. Fell apart in an instant. The battle that had seemed lost was now a war once more, but Voldemort was not yet finished. His focus turned, as it always did, to the boy in front of him, or rather, the boy who was supposed to be dead. Harry Potter had risen, and the final duel was inevitable. The two wizards circled each other in the Great Hall. History held its breath, but the power in that room did not lie entirely with the living. It lay in a dead man's wand, the Elder Wand. Let us understand the physics of this wand, because the entire duel hinges on it. The Elder Wand is the Death Stick, the most powerful wand in existence, but it has a fatal flaw. It is not a weapon of loyalty, it is a weapon of conquest. It serves the master who won it. Voldemort believed he had won it by stealing it from Dumbledore's tomb. The wand's true allegiance had shifted long before. It transferred not when Voldemort stole the physical object, but when Draco Malfoy disarmed Albus Dumbledore on the Astronomy Tower. Draco became the Elder Wand's master, though he never knew it. And then, months later, Harry Potter physically wrested Draco's own wand from him at Malfoy Manor. By that act, Harry conquered the Conqueror. He became the Elder Wand's master. The wand had never belonged to Severus Snape. It had never belonged to Lord Voldemort. It was Harry's, and a wand that recognizes its master cannot be forced to kill him. When Voldemort raised the Elder Wand and cast the killing curse, the final duel had ended with Voldemort's body crumpling to the floor, lifeless and ordinary at last. The Elder Wand had refused to kill its true master, Harry Potter, and the curse had rebounded not from a shield, but from the very loyalty of the Wands and Legions. Harry had offered Voldemort one last chance to feel remorse, to heal his shattered soul, but that was never a path Voldemort could take. And so the war ended not with a great explosion of dark magic, but with a single final, anticlimactic thud. In the moments that followed, the Great Hall of Hogwarts was a blur of motion and emotion. Survivors embraced, wept, and stared in disbelief at the broken body of the most feared dark wizard in a dark wizard in centuries. But the three who had carried the burden closest to their hearts were not yet done. Harry, Ron and Hermione stood together, exhausted beyond measure, but knowing that the work was not finished. The war was won, but the legacy of the scars remained. The immediate aftermath was a flurry of recovery and rebuilding. The injured were tended to, the dead mourned. But amid the chaos, there was a solemn, deliberate effort to ensure that the darkest magic ever conceived would never rise again. Harry knew the Horcruxes were all destroyed. The diary, the ring, the locket, the cup, the diadem, Nagini and the fragment inside himself. Each had been vanquished, but the knowledge of how to create a Horcrux still existed, and that had to be addressed. The wizarding world, in the months and years that followed, took their shape, took deliberate steps to erase the Horcrux ritual from history. It was not a simple matter of burning books. The knowledge was buried in ancient texts, in the private journals of dark wizards, in the whispered traditions of magical families. The Ministry of Magic, under new leadership and with the guidance of trusted scholars, launched a quiet but thorough campaign. Tom Riddle's own writings, the diary's remnants, and any records that might detail the incantation or the method were located and destroyed. The few surviving references in the restricted section of the Hogwarts library were sealed under layers of magical wards, accessible only to those who had proven their integrity beyond doubt. The very concept was deemed so vile that even discussing it became taboo. It was a cultural erasure, a deliberate forgetting, and it worked. Within a generation, the exact steps to create a Horcrux were known only to a handful of historians. None of them would ever speak of it aloud. But there was another layer to this legacy: the Hallows, the Elder Wand, the Resurrection Stone, the Cloak of Invisibility. Harry had been their master, but he understood that such power was not meant to linger in the world. The Elder Wand, forged by death itself in legend, had caused centuries of bloodshed. He could not allow it to continue, so he made a choice. He returned the wand to Dumbledore's tomb, not as a trophy, but as a final resting place, and he vowed never to seek its power again. The Resurrection Stone, which he had used to call his parents Sirius and Lupin in the forest, was dropped somewhere in the Forbidden Forest. He did not mark the spot. He did not want it found. The cloak, however, remained with him, passed down through his family, as it had been for generations. But the Hallows were no longer a set. They were scattered once more, their unified power broken, and the temptation of mastering death through ownership faded into myth. That was how the wizarding world ensured the Horcrux ritual was lost forever. But the scars on the survivors were not so easily healed. Harry, Ron, Hermione carried more than just memories. They carried the weight of having touched the darkest fragments of Voldemort's soul. For Harry, there was the lingering echo in his mind, not of Voldemort's presence, but of the emptiness where that fragment had been. He had felt the soul fragment die inside him, and in its place was a quiet human silence. But he also bore the physical reminders, the lightning bolt scar that no longer burned, but remained as a permanent mark of what he had endured. He would never be able to forget that he had been a Horcrux. That part of the world's greatest evil had lived inside him. It changed how he saw himself, even in the years of peace that followed. Ron struggled with a different kind of scar. The Locket had preyed on his deepest insecurities, amplifying his fears of inadequacy, jealousy, and abandonment. Even after it was destroyed, those fears did not vanish. He had to learn to rebuild his confidence, to trust that he was more than the boy who had once left his friends in the forest. He and Hermione worked through it, slowly, with patience and love, but the shadow of the Locket never fully lifted. It had shown him his worst self, and that image is not easily forgotten. Hermione, the brightest witch of her age, carried the weight of knowing how close the world had come to eternal darkness. She had researched Horcruxes, understood the theory, and helped destroy 3 of them with her own hands. She had witnessed the corruption of magic that could tear a soul to pieces, and she had seen what that did to Voldemort. The knowledge haunted her. She became an advocate for magical ethics, working to ensure that such magic never attracted the curious again. She poured her intellect into reforming the ministry, into education, into teaching young witches and wizards that some doors should never be opened. Together, the 3 of them represented the symbolic end of an era. The age of the darkest magic in the wizarding world had drawn to a close. Voldemort's ascent had been built on the corruption of the soul, on the mutilation of the self for immortality. But in the end, he had achieved neither immortality nor victory. His soul was so fragmented that when he died, there was nothing remained. There was no ghostly return, no echo. He was simply gone. The Horcrux ritual, for all its terror, had proven to be a final, ultimate failure. In the years that followed, the wizarding world rebuilt. The Great Hall was repaired, the families buried their dead, and the survivors learned to live with their memories. Hogwarts opened its doors every September, and the castle no longer bore the wounds of battle. But if you looked closely, you could still see the cracks in the stone, the scorch marks on the walls, the places where Bertie Beetle's boggart had once been. They left those marks there intentionally, a reminder, not of fear, but of resilience. The scars of the past became a part of the castle's history, just as the scars on Harry, Ron, Hermione and Harry carried became part of theirs. And yet, for all the healing, the question remains. What was the true cost of immortality? Not the price Voldemort paid, but the price paid by everyone else. The price of a war fought, the lives lost, the childhoods interrupted, the price of bearing the weight of a soul that was never meant to be divided. In the silent moments after the battle, when Harry stood alone in the ruined courtyard, he understood that surviving was not the same as being whole. The war might have ended, but the cost of immortality, the cost of chasing it, of fearing it, of resisting it, that cost would be measured for generations. And that is the story we have yet to fully reckon with. The previous chapter took us through the aftermath, the long and careful work of ensuring that the Horcrux ritual, that abomination of soul magic, would be erased from every known text, every shadowy archive, every whispered tradition. The wizarding world sealed those secrets away with more than locks and incantations. They bound them with a collective will to forget. But memory, as we know, has a way of leaving echoes. And so we return, one final time, to the living history of that terrible attempt to cheat against death. The truth is that Voldemort's legacy was never about immortality. It was about fragments. 7 pieces of a soul that had been torn apart so many times that the man who began as Tom Riddle had all but vanished. Each Horcrux was a scar on reality, and each one had to be found, faced, and unmade. Let us walk the broken path again, from the first to the last, to see the full shape of what was lost. The diary came first, born in the Chamber of Secrets in 1943. It was a tool and a trap, a piece of Voldemort's own adolescence preserved in ink and venom. Harry Potter destroyed it with a basilisk fang in the same chamber where it had been created. And the first crack in the Immortality plan appeared. The ring followed that same summer, forged from the murder of Tom Riddle Sr. and the Gaunt ancestors. Dumbledore found it hidden in the ruins of the Gaunt shack and recognized it for what it was, a Horcrux and a Hallow. He destroyed it with the sword of Gryffindor. But the curse on the ring claimed his hand, and soon his life. That was the second piece to fall. The Locket, Salazar Slytherin's own, was hidden in a cave of darkness and in fury. Dumbledore and Harry retrieved it at great cost, but the real Locket was already gone, stolen, and passed through shadowy hands until it ended up around the neck of Dolores Umbridge. In the Forest of Dean, Ron Weasley plunged the sword of Gryffindor into its heart, and the third fragment was silenced. The cup, Helga Hufflepuff's golden treasure, was locked in Bellatrix Lestrange's vault at Gringotts. The trio broke in, escaped on a dragon, and in the Chamber of Secrets, Hermione Granger drove a basilisk fang through its metal. The fourth piece shattered. The diadem, Rowena Ravenclaw's lost crown, had been hidden in the Room of Requirement for decades. In the chaos of the Battle of Hogwarts, Vincent Crabbe unleashed fiend fire that consumed the diadem and nearly everything around it. The fifth fragment burned. Nagini, the serpent, was Voldemort's final intentional Horcrux, bound to her master through the murder of Bertha Jorkins. She stayed close to him, coiled and watchful. In the final moments of the battle, Neville Longbottom stepped forward with the sword of Gryffindor and severed her head. The sixth fragment died, and then there was Harry, the accidental Horcrux, the fragment of soul that had no ritual, no vessel of its own, only the boy who lived. In the Forbidden Forest, Voldemort's own curse destroyed that piece, unknowingly doing what Harry could not do himself. The seventh fragment was unmade, and with it, the last tether that held Voldemort's soul together. 7 fragments, 7 destructions, and yet the cost was not counted in objects or even in lives. It was counted in what Voldemort had done to himself. Here is the ultimate irony. The man who feared death more than anything never truly lived. He stretched his existence across decades and murder, but each Horcrux took more of him than he ever gave back. His soul became a patchwork of stolen moments and hollow victories. He could not love, could not trust, could not feel remorse. He was not immortal. He was imprisoned inside the broken shell of his own making. To split the soul is to lose the self. The more pieces you tear away, the less there is to call human. Voldemort believed he was ascending, but in truth he was dissolving. He traded the fire of a whole spirit for the cold grip of 1,000 shadows. And in the end, he died not as a great dark lord, but as a man who had thrown away everything that made life worth living. This is the real lesson of the Horcruxes. They are not just objects of dark magic. They are warnings carved into the fabric of the world. Love cannot be split. Sacrifice cannot be contained in a locket. The wholeness of a soul is not a thing to be traded for fear. Voldemort chased immortality and found only isolation. He sought power and found only emptiness. The darkest chapter of magical history is closed now. The tale of a boy who wanted to escape death and instead became the very thing he fled. A ghost of a man, a memory of a monster. But his story is also about those who stood against him. Harry, who carried a piece of the enemy inside him and still chose to give himself up for others. Dumbledore, who bore the curse of the ring and used pain as fuel. Snape, who lived a double life and died with a secret love. They understood that the soul is not something to be divided. It is meant to be given, to be shared, to be risked. And in that giving, there is a kind of immortality that no Horcrux could never grant. So we close the book on this chapter of magical history. The Horcruxes are gone, the ritual is buried, but their shadow remains, a reminder that the cost of cheating death is often far greater than death of the self. And perhaps that is the only peace Voldemort ever found, not in victory, but in the end. What did you think of this journey? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this changed your perspective or taught you something new, consider subscribing for more mind-expanding content. And if you know someone who would find this as fascinating as you did, share it with them. These are the kind of conversations that matter.